Miss Marple and the widow of Wychford. The morning had begun like any other in St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple, her silver hair neatly pinned beneath a modest straw hat, was on her knees in her garden, tending to her prize-winning hydrangeas. The early June sunshine cast dappled light through the overhanging elms, and a gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of nearby roses across her well-kept lawn. "Good morning, Miss Marple," came the cheerful voice of her neighbour, Mrs. Dorothy Cartwright, who appeared at the garden gate with a newspaper tucked under her arm. "Have you heard the news about Victoria Lammerton?" Miss Marple looked up, carefully removing her gardening gloves. "Victoria Lammerton, the widow from Wychford? I don't believe I have." Mrs. Cartwright's eyes gleamed with the particular excitement that only fresh gossip could bring to a village like St. Mary Mead. "She's getting married again, after only 14 months of mourning, and to Robert Havisham, of all people." 14 months is quite respectable, I would think, Miss Marple replied mildly, though her pale blue eyes registered a flicker of interest. "And Mr. Havisham is the banker from Eastleigh, is he not?" "Yes, that's him. 20 years her senior, and richer than anyone in 3 counties, Mrs. Cartwright said with obvious relish. "They've announced a garden party at Wychford Manor this Saturday to celebrate their engagement. The whole village is invited." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "How nice. I knew Victoria's late husband, George, you know, a dedicated botanist. We corresponded occasionally about rare specimens." "That's right. Poor George, found dead in his greenhouse. Heart attack, wasn't it?" Mrs. Cartwright leaned closer to the gate. "Though there were whispers, of course. There often are," Miss Marple said softly, rising slowly to her feet with the careful movements of age. "But I always found Mr. Lammerton to be a perfectly pleasant gentleman, very passionate about his orchids." Mrs. Cartwright looked slightly disappointed at Miss Marple's measured response. "Well, you simply must come to the party. Everyone who's anyone will be there. Even that nephew of yours, the writer. I believe he's staying at the Blue Boar Inn this weekend. Raymond. How lovely." Miss Marple's face brightened genuinely at the mention of her nephew. "I hadn't received word he was visiting. He's researching for a new novel, they say. Something about village life." Mrs. Cartwright glanced at her watch. "Oh, I must be off. Vicar's committee meeting in 15 minutes. You will come to the party, won't you?" "I expect I shall," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. It would be nice to see Victoria again, and to meet Mr. Havisham properly. After her neighbour had hurried away, Miss Marple remained standing beside her hydrangeas, her weathered hands clasped before her, her gaze distant. Victoria Lammerton. There was something about the whispers surrounding George Lammerton's death that had never quite sat right with her, and now a hasty engagement to the wealthiest man in the area. Miss Marple reached for her watering can. People were so predictable, really. They reminded her so often of others she had known throughout her long life in St. Mary Mead, and she had learned that beneath the tranquil surface of village life, passions could run as deep and dangerous as any in the great cities of the world. She would most certainly attend the garden party at Wychford Manor, and perhaps, while others were distracted by champagne and congratulations, she might keep her eyes and ears open, just in case. Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect weather that seemed almost suspiciously obliging for an English summer. The sky was a flawless blue, dotted with only the most decorative of clouds, and a pleasant breeze kept the afternoon heat at bay. Miss Marple had dressed carefully in her best pale blue dress, with a modest lace collar, and a hat that, while not fashionable, was perfectly respectable for a garden party. Her nephew Raymond West had insisted on escorting her to Wychford Manor, offering his arm as they made their way up the sweeping gravel drive.
"I must say, Aunt Jane, you seem particularly interested in this engagement party," Raymond remarked with a sideways glance at his aunt. As a successful novelist, he prided himself on his powers of observation, though Miss Marple often privately thought that he observed much, but understood little.
"Oh, I'm merely being neighbourly," she replied. "And I knew George Lammerton slightly. A very knowledgeable plantsman." Raymond smiled indulgently. "Just don't start detecting anything, will you? I came to the country for peace and inspiration." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I never look for trouble, dear, though it does seem to present itself with remarkable regularity." Wychford Manor was an impressive Queen Anne house, set in expansive grounds at the edge of the village. As they approached, They could see that the garden had been transformed with marquees, floral arrangements, and strings of delicate paper lanterns for the evening. Servants in formal attire circulated with trays of champagne, and a string quartet played discreetly from a corner of the immaculately manicured lawn. "Miss Marple, how wonderful that you could come." Victoria Lammerton approached, resplendent in a fashionable cream silk dress that accentuated her still youthful figure. At 42 she remained strikingly beautiful, with copper-colored hair styled in elegant waves and vivid green eyes that always seemed to hold a hint of amusement. "Mrs. Lammerton, congratulations on your engagement," Miss Marple said warmly. "Oh, please call me Victoria, and thank you." She smiled, though Miss Marple noted it didn't quite reach her eyes. "And this must be your nephew, the famous author." Raymond preened visibly. "Raymond West. A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Lammerton. Your home is magnificent." "Thank you. Robert insisted we host the party here, rather than at his estate. He thought it would be less disruptive to move one man than an entire village's expectations." Victoria laughed lightly, but again, Miss Marple detected something strained in her manner. "And where is the fortunate Mr. Havisham?" Miss Marple inquired politely. Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Greeting some banking associates. He's invited several business connections. Networking never stops for Robert, even at his own engagement party." She lowered her voice slightly. "Between us, I sometimes wonder if he loves his ledgers more than he could ever love a woman." Before Miss Marple could respond, they were interrupted by a tall, thin young man with anxious eyes and a perpetual frown creasing his forehead. "Mother, Uncle William is asking for you. Something about the champagne not being properly chilled." Victoria sighed. "Miss Marple, may I present my son Edward?" "Edward, this is Miss Marple from St. Mary Mead, and her nephew, the novelist Raymond West." Edward nodded curtly, barely acknowledging the introduction. "Mother, please. Uncle William is making a scene." "Your uncle has been making scenes since he was in short trousers," Victoria replied with a touch of asperity. "But I'll come. Please excuse me, Miss Marple, Mr. West. Do enjoy yourselves." As Victoria was led away by her visibly agitated son, Miss Marple observed the interaction with interest. "Not exactly thrilled about his mother's remarriage, is he?" Raymond murmured. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "Though that's hardly uncommon. A son who has been the man of the house since his father's death might naturally feel displaced." They moved through the crowd, accepting glasses of champagne from a passing waiter. Miss Marple sipped hers delicately as her eyes scanned the assembled guests. She recognized many faces from the village, along with what appeared to be wealthier connections from further afield, distinguished by their more fashionable attire and slightly louder voices. "Miss Marple, what a surprise!" A hearty voice boomed from behind her. She turned to find Dr. Haydock, the village physician, beaming at her. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Dr. Haydock, how nice to see you," she replied. "You knew George Lammerton, I believe?" The doctor's expression sobered slightly. "Yes, poor fellow. Called out here in the middle of the night when he collapsed. Nothing to be done, I'm afraid. Massive coronary." "Was it unexpected?" Miss Marple inquired innocently. "He always seemed in good health when we corresponded about botanical matters." Dr. Haydock hesitated. "Well, between ourselves, his heart wasn't in the best condition. I'd warned him to avoid stress, but there was no predicting when it might happen." "I see," murmured Miss Marple. "And was Mrs. Lammerton present when he passed?" The doctor looked slightly uncomfortable. "Actually, no. She was in London for a few days, visiting her sister. The gardener found him the next morning in the greenhouse. Most distressing." Their conversation was interrupted by the sharp sound of breaking glass, followed by raised voices from the direction of the house. Heads turned as the guests nearest the terrace parted to reveal Robert Havisham, a solidly built man in his 60s with silver hair and an imposing presence, facing a much younger man whose flushed face suggested he had already consumed a significant amount of champagne. "You have no right!" the young man was shouting. "No right at all. This is hardly the time or place, Dr. Carmichael," Havisham replied coldly. "I suggest you compose yourself or leave my fiancée's property." "Your fiancée," the young man, Dr. Carmichael, laughed bitterly. "She was never meant to be yours." George wasn't even cold in his grave before you started circling like a vulture. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled guests. Victoria appeared on the terrace, her face pale. James, please. You're making a scene. Am I? Dr. Carmichael turned to her, his expression a mixture of hurt and accusation. Tell them, Victoria. Tell them what really happened to George. A tense silence fell over the garden. Victoria Lamerton stared at the young doctor, her composure cracking for the first time. Then, with remarkable self-control, she turned to the nearest servant. Please escort Dr. Carmichael to the gate, she said in a level voice. He is unwell and should return home to rest. 2 footmen moved forward, gently but firmly taking Dr. Carmichael by the arms. This isn't over, he called as he was led away. Ask her about the greenhouse. Ask her about the orchids. The guests watched in stunned silence as the young doctor was escorted from the grounds, his final accusations hanging in the air like the distant rumble of thunder on an otherwise perfect summer day. Victoria Lamerton turned to her guests with a brittle smile. Please forgive the interruption. Dr. Carmichael was a protégé of my late husband's, and took his death very hard. More champagne, everyone. As the party awkwardly resumed, Raymond leaned close to his aunt. Well, there's your detection served on a silver platter, Aunt Jane. A dramatic accusation at a garden party. It's like something from one of my novels. Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. Her pale blue eyes followed Victoria Lamerton as she moved among her guests, the perfect hostess once more. Then she turned her gaze to Robert Havisham, now deep in conversation with a group of serious-looking men in expensive suits, and finally to Edward Lamerton, who stood alone at the edge of the gathering, watching his mother with an unreadable expression. Yes, she said at last, so quietly that Raymond had to lean closer to hear her. But in real life, dear, the truth is rarely proclaimed so publicly. It tends to hide in the small details that most people overlook, like the fact that young Dr. Carmichael called this my fiancé's property, not our property, and the mention of orchids, George Lamerton's particular passion. I wonder. Her voice trailed off as she spotted a familiar figure moving purposefully through the crowd toward Victoria Lamerton. Inspector Craddock from the county police force. Even from a distance, his grim expression suggested that this was not a social call. Oh dear, murmured Miss Marple. I rather think the party is about to come to an unexpected end. The murmur of conversation across the garden faded to silence as Inspector Craddock approached Victoria Lamerton. Even the string quartet seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, their melody faltering and then stopping altogether. Miss Marple observed with interest how Robert Havisham immediately abandoned his business associates and strode purposefully toward his fiancée, positioning himself protectively at her side. Mrs. Lamerton, Inspector Craddock said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. I apologize for the intrusion, but I need to speak with you privately. Victoria's face remained composed, though she clasped her hands tightly together. Whatever you need to discuss, Inspector, can surely wait until after our celebration. I'm afraid it cannot, madam. The inspector's tone was polite but firm. It concerns Dr. James Carmichael. A flicker of emotion, was it fear, concern, crossed Victoria's face. Has he made some sort of complaint? I assure you, his behavior today was completely... Dr. Carmichael is dead, Mrs. Lamerton, Inspector Craddock interrupted quietly. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. Victoria swayed slightly, and Robert Havisham quickly put an arm around her waist. Dead? She whispered. But that's impossible. He was just here, not an hour ago. His housekeeper found him in his study when she returned from her half-day off. The inspector explained. Initial examination suggests poisoning. Given his outburst here earlier, I need to ask you and your guests some questions. At this, pandemonium erupted. Guests began whispering frantically to one another, some already edging toward the exit, while others pressed closer, eager not to miss a word. Edward Lamerton pushed through the crowd to reach his mother, his face ashen. This is outrageous, Robert Havisham declared, drawing himself up to his full height. You can't possibly imagine that anyone here had anything to do with this tragedy. Nevertheless, I must ask that no one leaves just yet, the inspector replied calmly. Sergeant Davis is at the gate, taking names and addresses. "I'll need to speak with several of you individually, beginning with Mrs. Lammerton, Mr. Havisham, and Mr. Edward Lammerton." Raymond leaned toward his aunt. "Good heavens, this is becoming more like one of my books by the minute. Poor Victoria to have such a scandal at her engagement party." Miss Marple made a non-committal sound, her clear eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her. She noticed how Edward Lammerton's hand trembled as he reached for his mother's arm, how Robert Havisham's expression was one of annoyance rather than shock, and most interestingly, how Victoria, after her initial reaction, had regained her composure with remarkable speed. "Raymond, dear," she said quietly, "I believe I should like to sit down. Perhaps you could find me a quiet spot. This excitement is rather taxing at my age." Her nephew, always solicitous of his aunt's comfort, despite his occasional impatience with her village parallels, quickly guided her to a secluded bench, partially screened by a magnificent wisteria in full bloom. From this vantage point, Miss Marple had an excellent view of the terrace, where Inspector Craddock was now leading Victoria and her family inside for questioning. "Shall I get you some water, Aunt?" Raymond asked. "That would be most kind," Miss Marple replied with a grateful smile. As soon as her nephew had departed, however, her expression became thoughtful, even calculating. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a pair of spectacles, putting them on to better observe the scene unfolding around her. "Miss Marple?" a voice inquired, and she looked up to find Dr. Haydock standing before her, his medical bag in hand. "Are you feeling unwell? This excitement can't be good for you." "I'm perfectly fine, thank you, Doctor," she assured him. "Just taking a moment's rest. But you seem to be in a hurry." Dr. Haydock sighed heavily. "Inspector Craddock has asked me to accompany him to Dr. Carmichael's house. Apparently the police surgeon is unavailable, and given the unusual circumstances, they want a preliminary examination as soon as possible." "How dreadful," Miss Marple murmured. "You knew Dr. Carmichael well?" "Not particularly. He was a newcomer to the area. Only set up practice about 2 years ago. Brilliant young man by all accounts. He specialized in tropical diseases. Quite unusual for a country doctor. Spent some time in research before deciding on general practice." Dr. Haydock frowned. "He did consult me once about George Lammerton's death. Seemed convinced there was something suspicious about it." "Indeed?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And what did you tell him?" "The truth that George died of heart failure. The symptoms were consistent, and there was no reason for an autopsy." Dr. Haydock hesitated, though I will admit, in hindsight, that James was quite insistent. He mentioned something about certain tropical plant toxins that can induce symptoms similar to a heart attack. "How very interesting," Miss Marple said softly. "And did you inform Inspector Craddock of this conversation?" "I've only just remembered it," the doctor admitted, looking troubled. "I'll certainly mention it now. Excuse me, Miss Marple." As Dr. Haydock hurried away, Raymond returned with a glass of water and found his aunt, looking unusually animated for someone who had claimed to be fatigued. "You look remarkably recovered," he observed dryly. "I suppose the prospect of a real-life murder mystery has a rejuvenating effect." "Don't be absurd, Raymond," Miss Marple chided gently, accepting the water. "A young man is dead, and a family is in distress. There's nothing entertaining about that." "Of course not," Raymond said quickly, looking abashed. "I only meant—" "I know what you meant, dear." Miss Marple patted his hand. "Now I wonder if you might do me a favor. I noticed a rather interesting greenhouse at the far end of the garden. George Lammerton's, I expect. I'd very much like to see his orchid collection, and I'd prefer not to walk all that way alone." Raymond sighed, recognizing the determined look in his aunt's eye. "I suppose there's no point telling you that we should stay here and wait for the police to dismiss us." "None whatsoever," Miss Marple agreed cheerfully. "Besides, we're not leaving the property. We're simply taking a little stroll around the garden, as any guests might do." The greenhouse was a substantial Victorian structure of iron and glass, gleaming in the late afternoon sun. As they approached, Miss Marple noted that it was divided into sections, with different environmental conditions maintained for various types of plants. The door was unlocked, and they stepped into a warm, humid atmosphere, heavy with the scent of exotic blooms. "Good gracious," Raymond exclaimed, looking around at the riot of colors and strange forms that surrounded them. "I had no idea orchids could be so bizarre." They are fascinating plants, Miss Marple agreed, moving slowly along the central path. Many of them have evolved quite extraordinary methods of attracting pollinators, and some, I believe, have developed rather powerful toxins. She paused before a bench, where several specimens were arranged with meticulous care, each labeled in a precise hand. One shelf above the bench held a collection of small bottles and vials, along with various gardening implements. "Look at this, Raymond," she said, gesturing to the labels. Mr. Lamerton was studying orchids from the Amazon basin, many of them used by native tribes for their medicinal or poisonous properties. Raymond leaned closer to examine the plants. "You don't actually think there's a connection between these plants and Dr. Carmichael's death, do you?" "I'm not thinking anything of the sort," Miss Marple replied primly. "I'm simply admiring a fine orchid collection, though I do wonder why some of these specimens appear to have been recently handled." She pointed to a plant with unusual purple spotted blooms, where several leaves showed signs of having been cut. Before Raymond could respond, a shadow fell across the doorway. They turned to find Edward Lamerton standing there, his face taut with anger. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded. "This greenhouse is private." "I do apologize," Miss Marple said with an air of elderly confusion. "Your father and I corresponded about orchids, you see, and I was so hoping to view his collection." The door was unlocked. Edward's expression softened slightly. "You're the botanist he wrote to? Miss Marple, isn't it?" "An amateur enthusiast only," she corrected him gently. "Your father was the expert. He mentioned in his letters that you shared his passion for orchids." "Did he?" Edward looked momentarily pleased. Then his face clouded again. "Yes, well, he taught me everything he knew. Before he died." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "It must have been very difficult for you, losing him so suddenly." "You have no idea," Edward said bitterly. "And now to have Mother remarrying so soon, and to a man like Havisham, who cares nothing for all this." He gestured around the greenhouse. "He wants to tear it down, you know. Says it's a waste of space and money. Plans to put in a swimming pool instead." "Oh dear, how distressing for you," Miss Marple murmured. "And what about Dr. Carmichael? I understand he was a protege of your father's." Edward's expression hardened. "James? He was more than that. He was father's research partner. They were working on a paper about medicinal properties of certain rare orchid species. James was convinced that father's work could lead to breakthroughs in treating tropical diseases." "And after your father died?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "James wanted to continue the research. He asked Mother to allow him access to the greenhouse and father's notes." Edward laughed humorlessly. She refused, said it was time to move on, that father's work was just a hobby, not important science. James was furious. "I see," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "And now poor Dr. Carmichael is dead as well. Most unfortunate." Edward gave her a sharp look. "Why do you say it like that? You think there's a connection?" Before Miss Marple could respond, they heard footsteps on the gravel path outside. Inspector Craddock appeared at the greenhouse door, looking harried. "Mr. Lamerton," he said curtly, "we've been looking for you. I need to continue our conversation." Edward's face paled. "I was just showing these guests my father's orchids." "Miss Marple," Inspector Craddock acknowledged with a slight nod. "And Mr. West. I'll need to speak with you both as well, of course." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple replied with a serene smile. "We're quite at your disposal, though I fear we can tell you very little. We had never met Dr. Carmichael before today's unfortunate scene." The inspector's gaze lingered on her face for a moment, as if trying to determine whether this harmless-looking elderly lady might know more than she was letting on. Then he turned back to Edward. "Mr. Lamerton, if you would come with me now. Your mother and Mr. Havisham are waiting in the library." As Edward followed the inspector out of the greenhouse, Raymond turned to his aunt with raised eyebrows. "Curiouser and curiouser. Do you realize what you've done, Aunt Jane? You've discovered that both the deceased had connections to exotic plants that could potentially cause symptoms resembling a heart attack or poisoning. If this were my novel, I'd be setting you up as the brilliant detective about to solve everything." Miss Marple adjusted her hat with a tiny smile. "Don't be fanciful, Raymond. I'm merely an old woman with perhaps too much curiosity for her own good. But I do think we should return to the main garden now. And on the way, I'd like to have a word with the Lamertons' gardener, if we can find him. Gardeners, you know, often see a great deal more than people realize. As they left the greenhouse, Miss Marple cast one last glance at the purple-spotted orchid, with the freshly cut leaves, her expression thoughtful. In her experience, murderers, like gardens, required both careful planning and regular maintenance, and sometimes the smallest detail, a cut leaf, a misplaced bottle, a casual remark, could be the first sign that something deadly was taking root. The garden party had transformed into something altogether different. Where earlier there had been laughter and champagne, now small clusters of guests spoke in hushed tones, their expressions ranging from shocked to morbidly fascinated. Several police officers moved methodically through the crowd, taking statements and occasionally leading individuals toward the house for more formal questioning. Miss Marple, with Raymond at her side, made her way slowly along the garden paths, her observant gaze missing nothing. She paused when she spotted a weathered man in his 60s, dressed in well-worn working clothes, attempting to make himself inconspicuous behind a hedge of yew. "Mr. Jenkins, isn't it?" she called gently. "George Lamerton's head gardener." The man looked startled, then wary. "That's right, ma'am. How did you—" "Mr. Lamerton mentioned you in his letters. He spoke very highly of your skill with his orchid collection." Jenkins's weathered face softened slightly. "Did he now? That's kind to hear. Mr. Lamerton was a good man. He was. Knew his plants better than anyone I ever met. I understand you were the one who found him that terrible morning," Miss Marple said sympathetically. Jenkins nodded, his expression darkening. "Worst day of my life that was. Came in early, I did, because we had a new shipment of specimens arriving from South America. Found him there on the greenhouse floor, stone cold. Looked peaceful enough, but it gave me a turn. It did." "I can imagine," Miss Marple murmured. "Was anything unusual about the greenhouse that morning? Anything out of place?" The gardener gave her a sharp look. "Why do you ask that?" "Merely curious," Miss Marple replied with an innocent smile. "In my experience, gentlemen with precise habits, as Mr. Lamerton must have been given the condition of his orchids, tend to leave things exactly so. Any disruption might be noteworthy." Jenkins hesitated, glancing around as if to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "Well, now you mention it, there was something odd. Mr. Lamerton always locked the rare specimens cabinet, the one with the most valuable plants and his research materials, but that morning it was open. And his notebook, the one where he recorded all his observations and experiments, it wasn't in its usual place." "How interesting," Miss Marple said. "Did you mention this to the police?" "There weren't no police, ma'am. Dr. Haydock said it was his heart, plain and simple." Jenkins frowned. "Though that young Dr. Carmichael, he asked me about it some weeks later, seemed mighty interested in what might have been moved or taken." Raymond, who had been listening with barely concealed impatience, broke in. "And what did you tell him?" "Same as I'm telling you. The cabinet was open, notebook out of place." And Jenkins lowered his voice further. "There was a smell, strange sort of smell, like almonds, but bitter-like." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Bitter almonds? Are you quite certain?" "As sure as I'm standing here," Jenkins said firmly. "Recognized it because my old dad worked in a chemistry lab, and he always warned us about that smell. Cyanide, he called it. But Dr. Haydock, he said it was just the orchids giving off a scent." "And did Dr. Carmichael seem to agree with that explanation?" Miss Marple asked. Jenkins snorted. "Not likely. Got quite excited, he did, asking all sorts of questions about which plants Mr. Lamerton had been working with most recently. And which were they? Those purple-spotted ones from the Amazon. The Phalaenopsis toxica, Mr. Lamerton called them. Said the native tribes used them for their arrow poisons." Jenkins shook his head. "But that's neither here nor there now, is it? Poor Mr. Lamerton's gone, and it seems Dr. Carmichael's followed him." A flash of movement near the terrace caught Miss Marple's eye. Victoria Lamerton had emerged from the house, looking pale but composed. At her side was not Robert Havisham, as might have been expected, but a slender woman in her 30s, with a striking resemblance to Victoria herself. "Who is that with Mrs. Lamerton?" Miss Marple inquired. "That'll be Miss Diana Westbrook, her sister," Jenkins replied. Arrived this morning from London for the party. Always been close, those two. Miss Marple watched as the sisters spoke urgently to each other. Victoria occasionally glancing nervously toward the greenhouse. Mr. Jenkins, do you happen to know if Mrs. Lammerton shared her husband's interest in orchids? Jenkins's weather-beaten face creased in a mirthless smile. Not likely. Mrs. Lammerton couldn't tell an orchid from a dandelion, and that's a fact. Always complained about the money Mr. Lammerton spent on his collection, said it was a waste.
And yet she's maintained the greenhouse since his death?
Only because of young Mr. Edward. He insisted. He did, said his father's work was important, and should be continued. Jenkins lowered his voice again. Between you and me, there's been terrible rows about it, especially since Mr. Havisham came on the scene. He wants it all cleared out. Turned into one of the modern garden rooms for entertaining. I see, murmured Miss Marple. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. You've been most helpful. As they continued their stroll, Raymond looked at his aunt with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. You're investigating, aren't you? Despite promising me you wouldn't. I'm merely gathering impressions, dear, Miss Marple replied serenely. And it seems to me that there are several interesting aspects to this situation, such as the fact that George Lammerton's death might not have been from natural causes after all. That bitter almond smell Mr. Jenkins mentioned is indeed associated with cyanide poisoning, and certain plant toxins can mimic heart failure symptoms quite convincingly. Raymond's eyes widened. Good Lord. You think George Lammerton was murdered, and now Dr. Carmichael too, because he suspected something? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that it would be most unwise to jump to conclusions without sufficient evidence. But I do wonder why Mrs. Lammerton seems so concerned about the greenhouse just now. They had made their way back to the main lawn, where Inspector Craddock was now speaking with Diana Westbrook, Victoria's sister. Even from a distance, Miss Marple could see that the conversation was tense, with Diana gesticulating emphatically while the inspector took notes. I wonder what that's about, Raymond murmured. I believe we may soon find out, Miss Marple replied, nodding toward Victoria Lammerton, who was approaching them with determined steps. Miss Marple, Victoria said when she reached them, her voice strained but polite. I understand you were in my husband's greenhouse earlier. With Edward. Yes, indeed, Miss Marple smiled apologetically. I hope you don't mind. Your late husband and I corresponded about orchids, you see, and I was so eager to view his collection. Victoria's expression flickered between suspicion and relief. I see. It's just that with everything that's happened, the police are being rather difficult about people wandering around the property. Quite understandable, Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Such a dreadful business. Poor Dr. Carmichael. Had you known him long? He was George's colleague, Victoria said, her tone carefully neutral. They worked together on some research project. I didn't know him well personally, and yet he seemed quite emotional about your engagement, Miss Marple observed mildly. Victoria's green eyes hardened. James had personal problems. He'd become obsessed with George's death. Couldn't accept that it was natural. He even tried to suggest that she broke off, composing herself. Well, it doesn't matter now. That someone might have had a reason to want your husband dead. Miss Marple finished the thought, her voice gentle but her gaze unwavering. How distressing for you. Victoria stared at her for a long moment. Miss Marple, you seem like a kind woman. Let me give you some advice. This isn't one of your nephew's novels. This is my life, my family. Edward is devastated by what's happened today, and frankly so am I. The last thing any of us needs is idle speculation. Of course, Miss Marple murmured. I meant no offense. Victoria's expression softened slightly. None taken. Now, if you'll excuse me, the inspector has more questions for me. She turned to go, then paused. Oh, and Miss Marple, the greenhouse will be locked from now on. Police orders. As Victoria walked away, Raymond let out a low whistle. Well, that was pointed. She's certainly not keen on you poking around, is she? No, Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully, and that in itself is rather interesting, don't you think? Before Raymond could respond, they were approached by Inspector Craddock, looking weary but determined. Miss Marple, he said with a nod. Mr. West. I'm afraid I must ask you both some questions about your movements this afternoon. Of course, Inspector, Miss Marple replied cheerfully, though I fear we'll be of little help. We were simply enjoying the party until all the commotion began. The inspector consulted his notebook. I understand you were seen entering the greenhouse with Edward Lamerton approximately half an hour ago. Not quite, Miss Marple corrected him gently. Raymond and I were already in the greenhouse when Mr. Lamerton arrived. He seemed rather surprised to find us there. I see. The inspector made a note. And what were you doing in the greenhouse, Miss Marple? Admiring George Lamerton's orchid collection. We corresponded about botany, you know. Did you touch anything while you were there? Miss Marple appeared to consider the question carefully. I don't believe so. Raymond? Definitely not, Raymond confirmed. We merely looked at the plants. Inspector Craddock regarded them both with a skeptical expression. Miss Marple, I've worked with you before. You have an unfortunate habit of turning up in the vicinity of murders. Now really, Inspector, Raymond began indignantly, but Miss Marple placed a calming hand on his arm. The inspector is quite right, dear. I do seem to encounter an unusual number of unfortunate incidents. But in this case, I assure you, we're merely guests at what should have been a happy occasion. Craddock's expression suggested he was far from convinced. Nevertheless, I must ask you both to remain available for further questioning. We're setting up a temporary base in the village hall, and I'll need formal statements from everyone who was present today. Naturally, Miss Marple agreed. Though I do wonder, Inspector, if you've considered the possibility that Dr. Carmichael's death might be connected to concerns he had about George Lamerton's passing. The inspector's eyes narrowed. What exactly do you know about that, Miss Marple? Only what was evident from his outburst today, she replied innocently. He did seem to believe there was something suspicious about Mr. Lamerton's death. And now, so tragically soon afterward, Dr. Carmichael himself has died in unusual circumstances. We're pursuing all relevant lines of inquiry, Craddock said stiffly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to speak with Mr. Havisham. As the inspector moved away, Raymond turned to his aunt with an expression of fond exasperation. You simply couldn't resist, could you? Dropping hints, raising suspicions. I merely pointed out what anyone might observe. Miss Marple replied serenely. And speaking of observations, Raymond, I think it might be time for us to take our leave. The light is fading, and these old eyes of mine don't function as well as they once did. Gladly, Raymond sighed. Though I suspect our departure won't be the end of your involvement in this affair. Perhaps not, Miss Marple admitted with a small smile. But for now, I should like to return home and reflect on all we've learned today. Something tells me that the events at Wychford Manor are far from concluded. As they made their way toward the gate, Miss Marple cast one last glance back at the house. On the terrace, silhouetted against the warm light from within, stood Robert Havisham deep in conversation with Diana Westbrook, Victoria's sister. Their heads were close together, and even from a distance there was an unmistakable intimacy to their posture that made Miss Marple's eyebrows rise slightly. How very interesting, she murmured to herself. How very interesting indeed. Sunday morning in St. Mary Mead found Miss Marple exactly where one might expect in her garden after church service, tending to her roses with meticulous care. The events at Wychford Manor had been the sole topic of conversation among the congregation, with theories ranging from the plausible to the wildly fantastical. Miss Marple had listened to it all with polite interest, offering no theories of her own, but absorbing every scrap of information that might prove useful. Now, as she carefully pruned a particularly fine specimen of her prized peace roses, she heard the garden gate open behind her. "Good morning, Miss Marple," came Inspector Craddock's voice. "I thought I might find you out here." She turned with a smile, removing her gardening gloves. "Inspector Craddock, how nice to see you. Would you care for some tea? The kettle's just boiled." "Thank you. That would be most welcome." The inspector followed her into the cottage, where the small sitting room was warm and inviting despite its modest furnishings. Miss Marple busied herself with the tea things, and soon they were seated with steaming cups and a plate of homemade shortbread between them. "I must say, Inspector, you look rather tired," Miss Marple observed. Craddock sighed. "It's been a long night. The preliminary report on Dr. Carmichael confirms poisoning, a plant-based toxin that affected his heart. Dr. Haydock is quite certain it's the same substance that might have been used on George Lamerton, had his death not been natural. I see, Miss Marple murmured. And have you determined what this toxin might be? That's where it gets interesting, Craddock said, leaning forward slightly. It appears to be derived from a rare orchid species, one that was part of George Lamerton's collection. The Phalaenopsis toxica, it's called. The purple spotted ones, Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Mr. Jenkins mentioned those. The inspector's eyes narrowed. You've been busy, Miss Marple? May I ask what else Mr. Jenkins told you? Miss Marple took a sip of her tea, then placed the cup delicately back in its saucer. He mentioned a detail about the morning he found George Lamerton's body. A smell of bitter almonds, and a cabinet that should have been locked but wasn't. Also, a missing notebook. Craddock sat back in his chair, his expression a mixture of irritation and resignation. I was afraid of this. You're investigating again. Not at all, Inspector, Miss Marple protested mildly. I merely happened to have a conversation with Mr. Jenkins while Raymond and I were strolling in the garden. The inspector looked unconvinced. And I suppose you merely happened to notice that Robert Havisham and Diana Westbrook seemed unusually familiar with each other? Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly. Why, Inspector? How observant of you. I did indeed notice something of the sort as we were leaving. Miss Westbrook admitted to me last night that she and Havisham have been involved for several months. She claims to have been unaware of his engagement to her sister until recently. How very awkward, Miss Marple commented. And does Victoria know about this entanglement? According to Miss Westbrook, she discovered it only yesterday morning, shortly before the party. Craddock frowned. It led to a significant argument between the sisters. Several servants overheard, raised voices. I see, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, and yet the party proceeded as planned. Mrs. Lamerton insisted on it. She said, and I quote, I've endured public humiliation once. I refuse to do so again. The inspector sighed. The question is, Miss Marple, does any of this have bearing on Dr. Carmichael's death? Or is it merely domestic drama? Miss Marple considered the question, her fingers idly tracing the pattern on her teacup. In my experience, Inspector, murders often have their roots in the most mundane of human emotions. Jealousy, greed, fear of exposure. If Victoria Lamerton felt betrayed by both her fiancé and her sister, that might indeed constitute a motive of sorts. For killing Dr. Carmichael? Craddock looked skeptical. What connection would that have? Perhaps none, Miss Marple admitted. Unless, of course, Dr. Carmichael's accusations yesterday were not merely about Victoria's hasty remarriage, but about something more specific, something that might have threatened her reputation or freedom. The inspector's expression sharpened. You're suggesting that if George Lamerton was murdered, Victoria might have been responsible, and that Dr. Carmichael suspected this. I'm not suggesting anything of the kind, Miss Marple replied primly. I'm merely considering possibilities. After all, Victoria Lamerton stands to inherit her husband's considerable estate, and if she were to marry Robert Havisham, their combined fortunes would be quite substantial. Except now it seems Havisham may have been more interested in the sister all along, Craddock mused. Which raises another interesting question, Miss Marple said, reaching for a piece of shortbread. If Victoria discovered this betrayal yesterday morning, why proceed with the engagement party at all? Unless there was some other reason she needed the engagement to appear intact, at least publicly. Before the inspector could respond, they were interrupted by a knock at the door. Miss Marple excused herself and returned a moment later with Edward Lamerton, looking pale and dishevelled. I apologize for intruding, Miss Marple, he said, his voice strained. The woman at the vicarage said, you might be home, and I need to speak with you. He stopped abruptly upon seeing Inspector Craddock. I didn't realize you had company. Please, sit down, Mr. Lamerton, Miss Marple said kindly. Inspector Craddock and I were just discussing yesterday's unfortunate events. Would you care for some tea? Edward shook his head, remaining standing. No, thank you. I can come back another time. Nonsense, Miss Marple insisted. Whatever you wish to discuss with me can surely be said in front of the inspector. We're all seeking the same thing after all. The truth about what happened to Dr. Carmichael. Edward hesitated, then sank into the nearest chair, his shoulders slumped in defeat. That's just it. I think I know what happened to James, and to my father as well. Inspector Craddock leaned forward, instantly alert. Go on, Mr. Lamerton. Last night, after everyone had gone, I went back to the greenhouse. Edward began, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to check something. A suspicion I've had for some time. The purple orchids, the ones Father was studying with James, several specimens have been tampered with recently, leaves and root structures removed. And why would that be significant? Craddock asked. Because those parts contain the highest concentration of the toxin, Edward explained. Father had isolated the compound. He and James were testing its potential as a treatment for certain tropical diseases, in carefully controlled doses, but in its raw form, it's deadly and nearly impossible to detect, unless you're specifically looking for it. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Inspector Craddock. And you believe someone extracted this toxin deliberately, to use as a poison? Edward nodded miserably. After Father died, James tried to continue their work. He asked to see Father's notebooks, his research journals, but Mother claimed they couldn't be found. James didn't believe her. He was convinced she had hidden or destroyed them, because he trailed off, looking conflicted. Because he suspected your mother might have had something to do with your father's death. Miss Marple suggested gently. It sounds terrible when you say it outright, Edward said, his voice cracking. But yes, James believed that Father had discovered something about Mother, and that she couldn't risk him revealing it. And what might that have been? Inspector Craddock asked. Edward shook his head. I don't know for certain. But Father had been acting strangely in the weeks before his death, distant, preoccupied. He spent hours in his study, going through old family papers and photographs, and he argued with Mother. I heard them once. Father said something about the truth always coming out eventually, and that he couldn't live a lie any longer. Miss Marple's expression remained compassionate, but her mind was working rapidly. Mr. Lamerton, when you went to the greenhouse last night, did you find anything else of note, besides the tampered plants? Edward looked up, his eyes haunted. Yes, in a hidden compartment beneath Father's workbench, a place only he and I knew about, I found this. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small leather-bound notebook. It's Father's private journal, his most important research notes, and on the last page, there's this. He opened the notebook to the final entry and placed it on the table between Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock. The handwriting was tight and precise, the ink slightly faded. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and read aloud. Final confirmation received today. DNA results conclusive. E. Not my biological son. V. Must have known all along. Confrontation inevitable. Must speak with J about implications for research inheritance. A stunned silence followed. Edward's face was rigid with pain. I found it last night. I had no idea all these years. Oh, my dear, Miss Marple said softly. What a dreadful shock for you. Inspector Craddock was studying the journal entry with narrowed eyes. This changes things considerably. If George Lamerton had discovered that Edward wasn't his biological son, that might indeed be a motive for Victoria to silence him. His estate was substantial, I understand, and much of it was tied to ancestral trusts that would only pass to blood heirs. But why kill James after all this time? Edward asked bitterly. Father has been dead for over a year. Perhaps because Dr. Carmichael had finally found proof, Miss Marple suggested. Your father mentions DNA results, medical evidence. As a doctor, James might have eventually gained access to those same results, especially if he was suspicious about your father's death. Edward stood abruptly, pacing the small room. When I found the journal last night, I confronted Mother. She denied everything at first. Then she broke down, admitted that she'd had an affair before I was born. She swore she didn't kill Father, that his heart attack was genuine, but she wouldn't say anything about James. And where is your mother now? Inspector Craddock asked sharply. At home, with Mr. Havisham and Aunt Diana. Mother took a sedative early this morning and has been sleeping since. Edward paused, looking at the inspector with anguished eyes. You don't think she killed them both, do you? My father and James? Before Craddock could answer, the telephone in Miss Marple's hallway rang shrilly. She excused herself to answer it, returning moments later with a grave expression. That was Raymond. she informed them. He's at the Blue Boar Inn. Apparently Diana Westbrook collapsed at breakfast and has been taken to the hospital. The doctors suspect poisoning. Good God, Craddock exclaimed, already on his feet. Mr. Lamerton, I need to speak with your mother immediately, and I'll need to examine that journal as evidence. Edward handed over the notebook reluctantly. I'll take you to the house. But please, Inspector, whatever happens, remember that she's still my mother. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple touched Edward's arm gently. Mr. Lamerton, just one question, if I may. When you confronted your mother last night, was anyone else present? Edward frowned. No, we were alone. Well, except for Aunt Diana. She was in the next room, but she came in when she heard Mother crying. Why do you ask? It may not be important, Miss Marple said carefully, but in matters like these, details often prove significant. Inspector, might I accompany you to Wychford Manor? An elderly lady's presence sometimes has a calming effect in difficult situations. Craddock hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Very well, Miss Marple, but you're there as an observer only. Understood. This is now officially a murder investigation. Potentially 2 murders. Of course, Inspector, Miss Marple agreed meekly, reaching for her hat and coat. I wouldn't dream of interfering. But as they left the cottage together, the gleam in Miss Marple's faded blue eyes suggested that her role would be considerably more active than mere observation. She had seen this pattern before, in other cases, in other villages. The cast of characters might change, but human nature, with all its passions, secrets and desperate measures, remained distressingly consistent. And someone at Wychford Manor, Miss Marple was now certain, had a great deal more to hide than a mere illicit affair from decades past. The atmosphere at Wychford Manor was tense when Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock, and Edward arrived. A police constable stood guard at the entrance, and through the open door, they could see several officers moving purposefully through the grand entrance hall, gathering evidence and taking photographs. Mother is in the drawing room, Edward said in a low voice. At least, that's where I left her with Mr. Havisham before I came to see you. And has she been informed about Miss Westbrook's condition? Inspector Craddock inquired. Edward shook his head. I don't think so. The hospital was going to call here, but I left immediately after Raymond telephoned Miss Marple. As they entered the drawing room, they found Victoria Lamerton seated in an armchair by the window, her face pale but composed. Robert Havisham stood beside her, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Both looked up as the door opened, Victoria's expression changing to one of alarm when she saw the inspector. Edward, what's going on? She asked, her voice strained. Why have you brought the police back? And Miss Marple? Before Edward could respond, Inspector Craddock stepped forward. Mrs. Lamerton, I'm afraid I have some disturbing news. Your sister, Diana Westbrook, has been taken to hospital. The doctors suspect poisoning. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. Diana? Poisoned? But that's impossible. She was fine when she left for breakfast at the inn. Nevertheless, that is the situation, Craddock said firmly. And in light of recent events, I must ask you some very direct questions. Robert Havisham moved forward, his manner protective. Inspector, Mrs. Lamerton is still in shock from yesterday's tragedy. Surely this can wait. I'm afraid it cannot, Mr. Havisham, Craddock replied coolly. Not when we now have 3 suspected poisonings connected to this household. 3? Victoria's voice was barely audible. Yes, Mrs. Lamerton. We have reason to believe that your late husband's death may not have been from natural causes after all. Victoria's face drained of what little color remained. That's absurd. George died of a heart attack. Dr. Haydock confirmed it. Without an autopsy, Craddock pointed out, and with certain symptoms that could be consistent with poisoning by a particular toxin, one derived from orchids in your late husband's collection. The same toxin that killed James Carmichael, Edward added bitterly. Victoria turned to her son, her expression a mixture of hurt and betrayal. Edward, how can you imply such a thing? Your own mother. Is it true? Edward demanded. What father wrote in his journal, that I'm not his biological son. A tense silence filled the room. Miss Marple, who had been standing quietly near the door, observed the tableau with keen interest. Victoria's hands trembled in her lap, while Robert Havisham's expression had shifted from protective concern to wary calculation. "Edward," Victoria finally said, her voice breaking, "I never meant for you to find out like this. It was a brief affair, before your father and I were married. I was young and foolish, and when I discovered I was pregnant, George agreed to claim you as his own. He loved you, Edward. He truly did. Until he found out the truth," Edward said coldly. "DNA results, Mother. He had proof." Victoria flinched as if struck. "Yes, he became suspicious as you grew older. Certain traits that didn't match his family. He had tests done without telling me. But Edward, you must believe me. I didn't kill him. Why would I? He had already agreed to keep the secret, for your sake." "For my sake?" Edward laughed bitterly. "Or for the sake of your inheritance. Father's family fortune would only pass to his blood heirs. If the truth came out, I would lose everything. And so would you." "Mrs. Lamberton," Inspector Craddock interjected, "can you account for your whereabouts yesterday afternoon, between 2 a.m. Victoria straightened in her chair. "I was here, of course, hosting the party." "The entire time? You weren't absent at any point?" "Well, she hesitated. "I did step inside briefly to check on the catering arrangements, and later, when that dreadful scene with James occurred, I went to my room for a few moments to compose myself." "Can anyone confirm this? The servants, I suppose?" "And Robert was with me part of the time." All eyes turned to Havisham, who cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Not the entire time, I'm afraid. I was speaking with business associates for much of the afternoon." "I see," Craddock said, making a note. "And what about your sister, Mrs. Lamberton? I understand there was some tension between you yesterday morning." Victoria's expression hardened. "Who told you that, Edward?" "It doesn't matter who told me," Craddock said evenly. "What matters is whether it's true. Diana and I had words, yes. A silly sisterly spat. Nothing serious." "About your relationship with Mr. Havisham?" Craddock pressed. A flush of colour rose to Victoria's cheeks. "That is a private matter. Not when it might relate to 3 poisonings," Craddock countered. "Mr. Havisham, would you care to explain the nature of your relationship with Miss Westbrook?" Havisham shifted uncomfortably. "I admire both Westbrook sisters greatly. There may have been some misunderstanding about my intentions." "A misunderstanding?" Victoria repeated incredulously. "Is that what you call it when I found you embracing my sister in the library yesterday morning?" The tension in the room ratcheted higher. Miss Marple, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, now stepped forward slightly. "Mrs. Lamberton, if I might ask, when exactly did you discover your husband's journal? The one containing his suspicions about Edward's parentage." Victoria looked startled by the question. I never found any journal. This is the first I've heard of it. But surely George would have confronted you with his discovery." Miss Marple persisted gently. He did mention some concerns, yes, but he never showed me any proof or journal." "And what about Dr. Carmichael?" Miss Marple continued. "He seemed to believe that your husband's death was suspicious. Did he ever share his specific concerns with you?" Victoria's composure began to crack. James was obsessed. He couldn't accept that George had died naturally. He kept hounding me about research notes and journals, claiming that George had made some breakthrough that I was suppressing. "And had he?" Inspector Craddock asked quietly. "No, at least, not that I knew of." Victoria's hands twisted in her lap. "George spent hours in that greenhouse, but he rarely discussed his work with me in detail. It was all very technical. Yet, you maintained the greenhouse after his death," Miss Marple observed. "Even though you had no personal interest in orchids." "For Edward's sake," Victoria said quickly. "He shared his father's passion for botany." Edward made a scoffing sound. "That's not true. You tried repeatedly to have the greenhouse dismantled. It was only my insistence that kept it intact. And now I understand why you were afraid of what might be discovered there." "Edward, please," Victoria pleaded. "Whatever you're thinking, you're wrong. I loved your father. Despite everything, I would never have harmed him." "And James?" Edward demanded. "Did you love him too? Is that why you refused to let him continue father's research?" Victoria paled. "What are you talking about?"
"James told me, Mother.
About your affair with him?
He said it started 6 months after father died, that you seduced him to keep him from investigating further, then broke it off when you met Robert. A shocked silence fell over the room. Victoria's face was a mask of horror. That's a lie. James was delusional. He became obsessed with me after George died, convinced we were meant to be together. When I rejected him, he turned vicious. Mrs. Lamerton, Inspector Craddock said gravely, I must inform you that we found letters in Dr. Carmichael's house. Letters from you of a highly personal nature, dating from several months ago. Victoria's composure finally shattered. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with silent sobs. Robert Havisham looked stunned, his mouth opening and closing without sound. I think, Miss Marple said quietly, that there may be more to this story than we yet understand. Inspector, might I suggest that Mrs. Lamerton be allowed a moment to collect herself? And perhaps we might speak with the household staff while we wait. The butler or the housekeeper might have observed something relevant. Craddock considered this, then nodded. A good suggestion, Miss Marple. Mrs. Lamerton, we'll continue this conversation shortly. He turned to a constable by the door. Please ensure that Mrs. Lamerton remains in this room. Mr. Havisham, I'd like you to accompany me for further questioning. As they left the drawing room, Miss Marple lingered, giving Victoria a long, thoughtful look. The woman seemed genuinely devastated, but whether from grief, fear of discovery, or simple exhaustion remained unclear. In the hallway, Edward turned to Miss Marple with anguished eyes. Do you think she did it? Killed father and James, and now tried to poison Aunt Diana? Miss Marple patted his arm gently. I think we should wait until all the facts are before us, Mr. Lamerton. In my experience, the truth is often more complicated than it first appears, but the evidence is certainly suggestive, Miss Marple agreed, but not yet conclusive. Tell me, who else had access to your father's greenhouse? Besides yourself and your mother? Edward frowned. Jenkins, of course. And the undergardeners, though they weren't supposed to handle the rare specimens, James had a key as well, for his research. And I suppose Aunt Diana, when she visited. Did she visit often? Every few months. She and Mother, were very close. Edward's expression darkened, until Robert Havisham came between them. I see, Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And did your aunt share your father's interest in botany? Not particularly, though she did train as a pharmacist before going into cosmetics. Her company develops natural beauty products. Edward paused, a new thought dawning. Are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, dear, Miss Marple said placidly. Merely gathering information. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I'll join the inspector in questioning the staff. She found Craddock in the kitchen, interviewing the elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Wilson, a formidable woman with iron-grey hair and a no-nonsense manner. The master's death was a terrible shock, Mrs. Wilson was saying, but not entirely unexpected. He'd been working too hard, staying up all hours in that greenhouse or his study. And Mrs. Lamerton's reaction, Craddock inquired. How did she take the news? She was away in London when it happened, Mrs. Wilson replied, visiting Miss Diana. When she returned and heard, well, she was prostrate with grief. Took to her bed for nearly a week. And afterward? Did her behavior seem unusual in any way? Mrs. Wilson considered this. Not unusual, no. Though there was that business with Dr. Carmichael. What business was that? Craddock leaned forward, instantly alert. He started calling at the house regularly. At first it seemed he was just offering comfort, as Mr. Lamerton's colleague, but then the visits became more frequent. Often when young Mr. Edward was out, Mrs. Wilson's disapproving sniff made her opinion of these visits quite clear. It wasn't proper, especially with Mrs. Lamerton still in mourning. Did you ever overhear any of their conversations? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Wilson glanced at her, then back at the inspector, who nodded permission for her to answer. I don't make a habit of eavesdropping, the housekeeper said stiffly. But there was one occasion, they were in the study, and the door wasn't quite closed. Dr. Carmichael was insisting that Mr. Lamerton's research couldn't be lost. He said something about potential millions and patents pending. Patents? Craddock echoed. For what? Some medical treatment, I gathered. Dr. Carmichael believed Mr. Lamerton had made a breakthrough just before his death. Something to do with those foreign orchids. Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock exchanged a significant look. Did Mrs. Lammerton seem interested in these potential patents? Miss Marple asked. Not particularly. She kept saying she didn't understand all the scientific details, that Dr. Carmichael should speak with Mr. Edward instead. Mrs. Wilson hesitated. But then, a few days later, I noticed Mrs. Lammerton in Mr. Lammerton's study, going through his papers late at night. When I inquired if she needed anything, she seemed startled, almost guilty. Said she was looking for insurance documents. And when was this? Craddock asked. About 2 weeks after the funeral, right around the time Dr. Carmichael's visits became more personal. The telephone in the hallway rang suddenly, its shrill sound cutting through the tension. A police constable answered it, then approached Inspector Craddock. Sir, that was the hospital. Miss Westbrook is conscious and asking to speak with you. She says it's urgent, a matter of life and death. Craddock rose immediately. I'll go at once. Miss Marple, I think you should accompany me. Your insights might prove valuable. Of course, Inspector, Miss Marple agreed, her eyes bright with interest. Though perhaps Mr. Edward should come as well. His aunt might be comforted by a family member's presence. Edward, who had been waiting in the hallway, nodded gratefully. I'd like that. I've always been fond of Aunt Anna. As they prepared to leave, Craddock instructed his officers to continue questioning the staff and to ensure that both Victoria Lammerton and Robert Havisham remained at the manor under supervision. I have a feeling, he muttered to Miss Marple as they walked to his car, that Miss Westbrook's statement is going to be the key to this entire case. Perhaps, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, but I wonder if we might make a brief stop on the way to the hospital. There's something in the greenhouse I'd like to examine more closely. Craddock hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes, Miss Marple, no more. If Miss Westbrook truly believes her life is in danger, we cannot delay. 5 minutes will be quite sufficient, Miss Marple assured him with a serene smile. For an old lady like me, you know, details are everything. And there's one particular detail about those purple orchids that has been troubling me since yesterday. As they walked toward the greenhouse, Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful, but determined. In her experience, murderers, like gardeners, often made one critical mistake. They underestimated how much evidence they left behind, even when they believed they had removed all traces of their work. And sometimes the most telling evidence could be found not in what was present, but in what was conspicuously absent. The greenhouse stood in silent dignity at the far end of the garden, its glass panes gleaming in the midday sun. A police constable had been posted at the door, but he stepped aside at Inspector Craddock's instruction, allowing them entry into the humid, fragrant interior. What exactly are we looking for, Miss Marple? Edward asked as they moved down the central aisle, past benches laden with exotic blooms. I'm not entirely certain, she admitted, but something about your father's purple orchids has been troubling me. The Phalaenopsis toxica, I believe they're called. Edward led them to the section where the rare specimens were kept, including the distinctive purple-spotted orchids. Several plants showed signs of recent handling, with cut leaves and disturbed root systems, evidence that someone had been extracting materials from them. These are the ones, Edward confirmed grimly. Father believed their toxin, in carefully controlled doses, could be effective against certain tropical parasites. He and James were developing a potential treatment. Miss Marple examined the plants with careful attention, her eyes narrowed behind her spectacles. Mr. Lammerton, did your father keep records of his specimens, documentation of when they were acquired, and their condition? Yes, of course. He was meticulous about that. Each plant has an individual card in that filing box. Edward pointed to a wooden box on a nearby workbench. Miss Marple approached the box and began leafing through the alphabetically arranged cards. Here we are. Phalaenopsis toxica. She studied the card carefully. According to this, your father had 5 specimens of this particular orchid. Edward nodded. That's right. They're extremely rare. It took him years to acquire them. Miss Marple looked up from the card to the bench, where the orchids were displayed. But there are only 4 plants here. A moment of silence followed, as they all processed this observation. Inspector Craddock stepped forward. his expression sharpening. "Mr. Lamerton, is it possible one plant was removed? Perhaps for legitimate research purposes?" Edward shook his head slowly. No, father would never have removed a specimen without updating his records. He was obsessive about his documentation. He paused, a troubled expression crossing his face. Unless James might have taken one for his research after father died, but even then he should have noted it. Miss Marple was now examining the 4 remaining plants more closely. These plants all appear to be mature specimens, several years old at least. But according to your father's records, one of the plants, the one numbered PT5, was a new acquisition, received only 2 weeks before his death. "Yes, that's right," Edward said, his brow furrowing. "It was the crown jewel of his collection, a rare variety from a remote region of the Amazon, thought to contain an unusually potent form of the toxin. Father was ecstatic when it arrived, and now it's missing," Miss Marple observed quietly. "How very interesting. Inspector, I believe we should check whether anyone removed this plant from the greenhouse, not for research, but for an altogether more sinister purpose." Craddock nodded grimly. If someone extracted toxin from these plants to poison George Lamerton and James Carmichael, they might have taken an entire plant as well to ensure they had a continuous supply. Or to prevent others from studying it, Miss Marple suggested. If this particular variety was significant to your father's research, Mr. Lamerton, its removal might have been intended to hinder anyone trying to continue his work. Edward's face paled as the implication sank in. So someone deliberately sabotaged father's research, and then killed him, and James to keep it quiet. But why? "Patterns," Inspector Craddock said succinctly. "According to Mrs. Wilson, Dr. Carmichael mentioned potential millions and patents pending. If your father had developed a valuable new medical treatment, controlling that research could mean substantial financial gain." Miss Marple was still examining the orchid records, her expression thoughtful. "Mr. Lamerton, do you know who would have been named in any patents your father might have filed? Who would have benefited financially from his discoveries?" Edward hesitated. "I'm not certain. Father never discussed the business aspects with me. I assumed any patents would be in his name, with perhaps James as a co-inventor. The proceeds would presumably go to his estate, to mother and me. Unless," Miss Marple said carefully, "there was reason to believe you were not his biological son, in which case the terms of any trust or inheritance might be affected." "Which brings us back to Victoria Lamerton, as a suspect," Craddock said, checking his watch. "Miss Marple, we should proceed to the hospital. Miss Westbrook is waiting, and her testimony may clarify some of these questions." As they turned to leave, Miss Marple paused, her attention caught by something on the workbench. "One moment, Inspector." She moved closer, examining what appeared to be a small notebook, half hidden beneath some gardening tools. "What's this?" Edward joined her, his expression surprised. "That looks like one of Father's field notebooks. He used them for preliminary observations before transferring the data to his formal research journals." Miss Marple carefully opened the notebook. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, detailed notes on the Phalaenopsis toxica, including chemical analyses, extraction methods, and potential medical applications. The final pages, however, contained something different. Personal observations written in a more hurried, emotional hand. "Diana visited today," Miss Marple read aloud. "Showed unusual interest in PT5, asked detailed questions about extraction methods and toxicity, claimed it was for her natural cosmetics research, but her knowledge of pharmacology seems more advanced than I recalled. Mentioned financial difficulties with her company. Must discuss with Victoria, concerned about Diana's interest coinciding with arrival of patent attorney's letter." She turned the page to find a final entry. "Have spoken with James about my suspicions. He agrees the timing is concerning. Diana's company on verge of bankruptcy, according to financial papers. She desperately needs capital injection. Will confront her tomorrow after chemical analysis is complete. If toxin traces match, must inform authorities." The entry was dated the day before George Lamerton's death. A heavy silence fell over the greenhouse. Edward looked stunned. "Aunt Diana?" Father suspected Aunt Diana of what exactly? Of showing inappropriate interest in a highly toxic plant, it seems, Miss Marple said gently. possibly with the intention of using that toxin for purposes your father found concerning. And now she's in the hospital, allegedly poisoned herself, Inspector Craddock said thoughtfully. Either she's another victim, or it's an elaborate deception, Miss Marple finished. A way to direct suspicion elsewhere, while ensuring she appears to be a victim rather than a perpetrator. Edward shook his head in disbelief. But that would mean she poisoned herself. That's madness. Not necessarily, Miss Marple replied. A carefully calculated dose, enough to cause concerning symptoms, but not to endanger her life. Someone with pharmaceutical training would know precisely how to manage such a thing, which Diana Westbrook has, Craddock noted grimly. We need to get to the hospital immediately, and I want this notebook secured as evidence. He called to the constable at the door, instructing him to bag the notebook carefully and have it brought to the station. As they hurried back to the inspector's car, Miss Marple's mind was racing, assembling the pieces of the puzzle with practiced precision. There was still something missing. Something that would explain, not just the motive, but the complex sequence of events that had led to 2 deaths, and possibly a 3rd attempt. Inspector, she said as they drove toward the hospital, I believe we should telephone ahead and request that a nurse remain with Miss Westbrook at all times. And perhaps that any medication she requests be carefully monitored. Craddock glanced at her sharply. You believe she might make another attempt? On herself? Or on someone else? Miss Marple said quietly. If Diana Westbrook is indeed responsible for these poisonings, she's demonstrated both careful planning and a willingness to eliminate anyone who threatens her. Finding herself cornered might prompt desperate measures. Edward, seated in the back of the car, looked increasingly distressed. This is impossible. Aunt Diana has always been kind to me. She's Mother's closest confidant. Why would she do any of this? Money can be a powerful motivator, Mr. Lamerton, Miss Marple replied gently, as can fear of exposure. If your father had discovered something incriminating about your aunt, something beyond her interest in his toxic orchids, she might have felt she had no choice but to silence him. And James too? And now Mother? Dr. Carmichael appears to have suspected the truth about your father's death, Inspector Craddock explained. As for your mother, if she knew or suspected your aunt's involvement, she too would represent a threat. Though there's another possibility, Miss Marple added thoughtfully. Your mother and aunt might have been working together initially. Perhaps they had a falling out over Mr. Havisham, or over the distribution of proceeds from your father's research. Edward buried his face in his hands. This is a nightmare. My whole family. I don't know what to believe anymore. Miss Marple regarded him with compassion. The truth, Mr. Lamerton, however painful, is always preferable to uncertainty. And I believe we're about to discover at least part of it. The car pulled up at the small local hospital, its red brick facade somber in the afternoon light. As they hurried through the entrance, they were met by a harried-looking nurse. Inspector Craddock, thank goodness you're here. Miss Westbrook has been asking for you repeatedly. She's quite agitated.
Is she under constant observation, as I requested?
Craddock asked. Yes, Inspector. And we've secured all medications, as you instructed. Though she hasn't asked for anything beyond what the doctor prescribed, the nurse led them down a corridor to a private room. Through the half-open door, they could see Diana Westbrook propped up in bed, her normally elegant appearance marred by the pallor of illness and the sterile hospital surroundings. She looked up as they entered, her eyes widening at the sight of Edward. Edward? Oh, thank God you're here. Has Victoria been arrested yet? She asked urgently. Edward stared at his aunt in confusion. Arrested? What are you talking about? Diana's gaze shifted to Inspector Craddock. You must listen to me. It's Victoria. She's behind everything. George's death, James Carmichael's murder, and now she's tried to poison me too. My own sister. That's a very serious accusation, Miss Westbrook, Craddock said carefully. Do you have evidence to support it? Yes. I found proof last night. Papers in Victoria's desk drawer. Notes on toxin extraction. Calculations of dosages. She's been planning this for months. Diana's voice was tight with urgency. She killed George when he discovered Edward wasn't his biological son. She was afraid of losing the Lamerton fortune. Then she killed James when he got too close to the truth. And when she found out about Robert and me, she tried to poison you too, Inspector Craddock finished. A convenient theory, Miss Westbrook. Except for one detail. What's that? Diana demanded. We found George Lamerton's field notebook in the greenhouse just now, Craddock said quietly. His final entry expressed concern about your interest in his most toxic orchid, the day before he died. The color drained from Diana's face. That's absurd. George and I barely discussed his research. And yet, Miss Marple interjected gently, he specifically noted your detailed questions about extraction methods and toxicity. He also mentioned your company's financial difficulties and his intention to confront you after completing a chemical analysis. Diana's expression hardened. You can't possibly believe that notebook over me. Victoria obviously planted it there after I was hospitalized. She's framing me. Is she? Inspector Craddock asked skeptically. Or are you attempting to frame her, Miss Westbrook? Perhaps by planting evidence in her desk and then staging your own poisoning? This is outrageous. Diana tried to sit up further, wincing with apparent pain. Edward, surely you don't believe these accusations. Your mother killed your father. She's been manipulating all of you. Edward looked at his aunt with new eyes, seeing not the warm, familiar face he'd known all his life, but a stranger capable of calculated deception. The missing orchid, Aunt Diana. What did you do with it? What missing orchid? I don't know what you're talking about. But her voice had lost its conviction, and her eyes darted nervously to the hospital room door. PT5, Edward persisted. Father's most valuable specimen. It disappeared around the time of his death. Did you take it for your cosmetics research, or for its toxin? Diana's composure cracked. You don't understand. My company was failing. I'd invested everything, mortgaged my house to the hilt. When George showed me what that plant could do, the pharmaceutical applications, I knew it could save everything I'd built. I just wanted a sample. That's all, but he refused. Said it was too dangerous, that the extraction process had to be strictly controlled. So you took matters into your own hands, Inspector Craddock said grimly. Stole the plant and silenced George before he could report his suspicions. It wasn't like that. Diana protested. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted to make him ill enough to delay his meeting with the patent attorney. A small dose, enough to cause temporary symptoms, but I miscalculated. His heart was weaker than I realized. Edward made a strangled sound of distress. Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on his arm as Inspector Craddock continued his questioning. And, Dr. Carmichael, did you miscalculate his dose as well? Diana's eyes filled with tears. James wouldn't let it go. He kept investigating, kept pushing. When he found trace evidence of the toxin in the samples he'd taken during George's autopsy, he confronted me privately, said he'd go to the police if I didn't confess. So you silenced him too, Craddock said coldly, and then attempted to frame your sister for both murders. Victoria deserved it. Diana spat, her gentle demeanor vanishing completely. All my life she's had everything handed to her. The family beauty, the wealthy husband, the perfect life. Meanwhile, I struggled for every scrap of success, and then when I finally found happiness with Robert, she stole him away too. Robert Havisham approached you first? Miss Marple asked, picking up on the implication. Yes, we met at a charity function 6 months ago. We were practically engaged, unofficially. Then Victoria met him at my company's launch party, and suddenly he was sending her flowers, taking her to dinner. Diana's face contorted with bitterness. She couldn't bear to see me happy. She had to take him, just like she took everything else. So when Victoria discovered your relationship with Robert yesterday morning, Inspector Craddock began. I knew she'd make a scene, ruin everything. So I acted first. A small dose in her morning tea, just enough to make her ill during the party. To humiliate her publicly as she'd humiliated me. Diana's voice had taken on a feverish quality, but somehow she didn't drink it. Then that fool James showed up and started making accusations, and everything fell apart. So you poisoned yourself instead, Miss Marple concluded quietly, to divert suspicion and frame Victoria. Diana stared at her with naked hatred. You interfering old woman. You have no proof of any of this. It's my word against a dead man's notebook. Victoria is the one with the obvious motive, protecting her inheritance and her son's position. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed mildly. Except for one detail. Miss Westbrook, the missing orchid. If we were to search your London flat, would we find it there? Or perhaps at your company's laboratory? A flash of panic crossed Diana's face before she could control it. You're bluffing. You have no warrant to search my property. We will by this evening, Inspector Craddock assured her, along with authorization to test all your cosmetic formulations for traces of Phalaenopsis toxica. He turned to the uniformed officer who had accompanied them. Constable, please inform Miss Westbrook of her rights. She is under arrest on suspicion of the murders of George Lamerton and James Carmichael and the attempted murder of Victoria Lamerton. As the constable began reciting the formal caution, Diana Westbrook seemed to collapse in on herself, the fight draining from her body. She looked suddenly older, smaller, a shadow of the elegant, confident woman she had appeared to be. She wouldn't have appreciated him anyway, she said quietly, almost to herself. George's brilliance, his discovery. To Victoria, it was just another of his obsessions, taking time away from her social calendar. I would have made something of it, something worthy of him. Edward, who had been silent throughout this confession, finally spoke, his voice tight with emotion. Did you ever care for any of us? For me? Or was it all just an act? Diana looked up at him, genuine regret flickering across her features. Oh, Edward, you were the only innocent in all of this. I did love you, in my way. You were always more like your father than you knew. Not George, but your real father. He had the same intellectual curiosity, the same gentle spirit. My real father? Edward repeated, stunned. You know who he is? A twisted smile played across Diana's lips. Of course I know. Victoria and I shared everything once. Even our mistakes. Ask her about Professor Alan Harrington, her tutor at university, the brilliant botanist who first introduced her to the world of exotic plants, the man whose passion for orchids was passed, ironically, to the son he never knew he had. Edward staggered back as if physically struck. Miss Marple steadied him with a surprisingly strong grip on his arm. Come, Mr. Lamerton, she said gently. I think you've heard enough for now. Inspector Craddock will handle the rest. As they left the hospital room, Edward turned to Miss Marple with haunted eyes. How could she do it? Kill her own brother-in-law, attempt to murder her sister, and all for money, and... what? Revenge? People are capable of terrible things when they feel they've been wronged, Mr. Lamerton, Miss Marple replied sadly. Your aunt convinced herself that your mother had stolen everything from her success, love, happiness. Bitterness, when nursed over many years, can poison the soul more thoroughly than any plant toxin. And my mother? Was she truly innocent in all this? I believe so. Yes. Though she has her own secrets to answer for. Miss Marple patted his arm consolingly. But that's a conversation for another day, perhaps. For now, she needs to know that she's safe, and that you know the truth. As they walked through the hospital corridor, Edward squared his shoulders, preparing to face the next chapter in his family's complicated history. Behind them, Inspector Craddock continued the formal process of arrest, his voice a steady counterpoint to Diana Westbrook's increasingly desperate protestations, and Miss Marple, observing it all with her clear, uncompromising gaze, reflected once again on the curious similarity between gardens and human lives. How both could appear perfectly cultivated on the surface, while beneath the soil, roots twisted and tangled in patterns invisible to the casual observer. Only when unearthed, as she had done today, did the true nature of those hidden connections become clear. The next morning dawned bright and clear over St. Mary Mead, the kind of perfect English summer day that seemed at odds with the dark events of the previous weekend. Miss Marple was in her garden again, this time deadheading her roses with particular attention, when the garden gate opened to admit her nephew Raymond. Good morning, Aunt Jane, he called, making his way along the path. I see you've returned to your natural habitat after all the excitement. Miss Marple straightened up with a slight wince, setting aside her secateurs. Gardens don't tend themselves, dear, regardless of what else might be happening. Besides, I find it helps to restore a sense of order. Raymond smiled ruefully. Order is certainly what was lacking at Wychford Manor. I've just come from the village shop, where Mrs. Blackett gave me a complete update, or at least her version of it. The whole village is talking of nothing else. I can well imagine, Miss Marple said dryly. Murder and attempted murder are rare events in St. Mary Mead, thankfully. Though not as rare as one might wish. Inspector Craddock telephoned me this morning, Raymond continued, following his aunt to the small wrought iron table where a tea tray awaited them. He wanted to express his gratitude for your assistance. Apparently the search of Diana Westbrook's London flat yielded exactly what you predicted, the missing orchid, installed in a specially constructed terrarium, along with detailed notes on toxin extraction. How sad, Miss Marple murmured, pouring tea for them both. Such a brilliant mind, turned to such destructive purposes. They also found evidence in her cosmetics laboratory, traces of the orchid toxin in various stages of refinement. It seems she was indeed attempting to incorporate it into her product line, though presumably in non-lethal doses. Yes, I rather thought that might be the case, Miss Marple nodded. Her company was on the verge of bankruptcy, according to George Lamerton's notes. A revolutionary new ingredient with proven pharmaceutical properties might have saved it and made her fortune in the process. Raymond shook his head in wonder. And you deduced all this from a missing plant and a notebook entry? Not entirely, Miss Marple demurred. There were other indicators. Diana's pharmaceutical training, for one thing. The specific knowledge required to extract and administer the toxin in carefully calculated doses. And then there was her elaborate attempt to frame Victoria, which suggested a deep-seated resentment rather than mere opportunism. Not to mention her convenient poisoning just when suspicion was beginning to fall on her. Raymond added. Yes, that was particularly telling, Miss Marple agreed. A desperate gambit, but one that might have succeeded had we not found George's notebook when we did. They sipped their tea in contemplative silence for a moment before Raymond spoke again. And what of Edward Lamerton? How is he faring after all these revelations? Miss Marple's expression softened with genuine sympathy. As well as can be expected, under the circumstances. Inspector Craddock tells me he's been remarkably composed, helping the police compile evidence against his aunt, while supporting his mother through the ordeal, and the business about his biological father. That must have been quite a shock. Indeed, though in some ways perhaps a relief as well. Edward always felt himself something of an outsider in the Lamerton family, with his academic interests and gentle temperament. To discover that he is in fact the son of a distinguished botanist might help explain much that he found puzzling about himself. Has he made contact with this Professor Harrington? Not yet, I believe. Some wounds need time to heal before new connections can be formed. Miss Marple sighed softly, though I understand that Victoria has been more forthcoming about the past since Diana's arrest. The burden of secrets kept too long can be crushing. Raymond leaned back in his chair, studying his aunt with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. You know, Aunt Jane, I've watched you solve enough mysteries over the years that I should no longer be surprised. But somehow, you continue to amaze me. How do you do it? See what others miss. Miss Marple smiled, a hint of mischief in her pale blue eyes. I simply observe, dear. People, you know, are remarkably consistent in their behaviors, regardless of social standing or education. Diana Westbrook reminded me very much of Mary Higgins, the vicar's younger daughter from when I was a girl, always in the shadow of her prettier, more popular sister, always striving to outdo her, to prove her own worth. When Mary's sister became engaged to the young man Mary had set her cap for, Mary put belladonna in her sister's face cream, not enough to kill, just enough to cause a dreadful rash before the wedding. Raymond chuckled despite himself, and from that village scandal to murder with exotic orchid toxins, that's quite a leap, Aunt. Human nature doesn't change, Raymond. Only the trappings and circumstances. Miss Marple set down her teacup with an air of finality. The root of it all is the same: jealousy, resentment, a sense of injustice festering over time. Diana Westbrook spent decades watching her sister attain effortlessly what she herself struggled to achieve. When George Lamerton inadvertently offered her a chance at the success and retinue she craved, she seized it, regardless of the cost. A polite cough from the garden gate interrupted their conversation. They looked up to find Victoria Lamerton standing there, elegant even in simple day clothes, though her face showed the strain of recent events. Miss Marple, she said hesitantly, I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all, my dear, Miss Marple replied warmly, rising to her feet. Raymond and I were just discussing the curious nature of gardens, how they require both vigilance and patience. Do join us for tea. Victoria moved forward, accepting the offered chair with a grateful smile. "I wanted to thank you personally," she said, her voice low and earnest. "Edward told me how instrumental you were in uncovering the truth. Without you, I might well have been arrested for crimes I didn't commit. Crimes against my own husband and sister, no less. I merely observed what was there to be seen," Miss Marple replied modestly. "Inspector Craddock would have reached the same conclusions eventually." "You're too kind," Victoria said, accepting a cup of tea from Raymond. "But we both know that's not necessarily true. The evidence Diana had planted against me was quite convincing. She'd always been meticulous in her planning." "Yes, I rather gathered that," Miss Marple nodded. "A quality that served her well in business, I imagine, but proved dangerous when turned to darker purposes." Victoria's composure faltered slightly. "I still can't quite believe it. My own sister, we had our differences, of course, but I never imagined she harbored such resentment toward me, such hatred. People often conceal their deepest feelings, Mrs. Lammerton, sometimes even from themselves." "Victoria, please," she corrected gently. "After all we've been through, I think we can dispense with formalities." She hesitated, turning the teacup in her hands. "Edward told me you know about his father, about Alan." "Only what came out during your sister's confession," Miss Marple assured her, "and it's certainly not my place to judge events that occurred long before I knew any of you." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, that she blinked away determinedly. "I loved George, you know, despite everything. Our marriage wasn't perfect, whose is? But we built a life together. He accepted Edward as his own, even knowing the truth, at least, until those DNA tests confirmed what he'd long suspected." "That must have been very difficult for you both," Miss Marple said sympathetically. "It was. George was a proud man, from a family obsessed with lineage and bloodlines. The idea that the Lammerton name and fortune might pass to someone not of his blood, it troubled him deeply." Victoria sighed. "We argued about it that last night before I left for London. He wanted to change his will, to protect certain family heirlooms and properties from passing to Edward. I begged him to reconsider, to remember the son he'd raised rather than fixating on biology." "And did he agree?" "I don't know. I left for London the next morning, still angry. We didn't resolve anything." Victoria's voice caught. "And then he was gone. All these months. I've carried the guilt of those last harsh words between us." "You couldn't have known what would happen," Raymond offered consolingly. "No, but perhaps if I'd been there." Victoria trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "But there's no point in such thoughts now. What's done is done. I need to focus on Edward, on helping him through all this." "How is he coping?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Better than I would have expected. He's always been resilient, despite his quiet nature." A small, sad smile touched Victoria's lips. "He's asked me about Alan, his biological father. It seems Diana was right about one thing. Edward did inherit his passion for botany from him. Alan was brilliant, dedicated to his research in a way that I, as a rather frivolous young woman, found both intimidating and fascinating. Will Edward meet him, do you think? Perhaps in time. Alan is in Brazil now, continuing his research in the Amazon basin. I've written to him, explaining everything. It's long overdue." Victoria set down her cup decisively. "But that's for the future. For now, there are more pressing matters to address." "Such as?" Raymond prompted. "The greenhouse, for one thing. Edward wants to continue both his father's George's research and James Carmichael's work on medical applications of the orchid compounds. He believes they were on the verge of a significant breakthrough, one that could help countless people suffering from tropical diseases." "That sounds like a worthy endeavor," Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Yes, I think so too. Whatever legal complications arise from Diana's actions, Edward is determined that some good should come from all this tragedy." Victoria hesitated. "And then there's Robert." "Ah, yes. Mr. Havisham," Miss Marple murmured. "I assume the engagement is over, of course." Victoria confirmed, a flash of anger briefly hardening her features. To think he was pursuing both sisters simultaneously, playing us against each other for his own amusement. The man has no scruples whatsoever. Men rarely do when their vanity is involved, Miss Marple observed with the wisdom of long experience. "But perhaps it's just as well. I'm not convinced he would have made you happy in the long term." Victoria gave a short, surprisingly genuine laugh. No, I rather think you're right about that. Too concerned with appearances and social connections, too much like my parents in fact, who were always more interested in who one knew than in who one was. She rose from her chair with fluid grace. But I've taken enough of your time with my troubles. I just wanted to express my gratitude and to invite you both to tea at Wychford Manor once things have settled. Edward would be delighted to show you his work on the orchid hybrids he's developing. That would be most enjoyable, Miss Marple said sincerely. Gardens and their tenders must persevere, even after storms have passed through. As Raymond escorted Victoria to the garden gate, Miss Marple remained at the table, her gaze distant, contemplating the curious parallels between the cultivation of plants and the nurturing of human relationships. Both required attention to subtle signs of distress. Both could be damaged by neglect or excessive control, and both, when properly tended, could recover from even the most devastating blight to bloom again. When Raymond returned, he found his aunt smiling serenely to herself. "What has you looking so satisfied, Aunt Jane?" he inquired, resuming his seat. "Oh, just reflecting on how appropriate it is that this whole tragic affair centered around a greenhouse," she replied. "So much of human behavior is like gardening, you know. We plant seeds of kindness or resentment. We nurture relationships, or allow them to wither. We prune away what's harmful, or let it grow unchecked until it overwhelms everything else." And Diana Westbrook allowed her bitterness to become invasive, choking out all other feelings. "Precisely," Miss Marple nodded. While Victoria, despite her own mistakes and secrets, maintained enough healthy growth in her life to survive when the storm came. Raymond regarded his aunt with affectionate exasperation.
"You and your garden metaphors."
"I suppose you'll be working this case into one of your village parallels for years to come." "Perhaps," Miss Marple admitted with a twinkle in her eye. "Though I rather think Mrs. Blackett at the village shop will have worn out the story long before I have occasion to reference it." "Speaking of stories," Raymond said, clearing his throat self-consciously, "this whole affair has given me an idea for a new novel. A country house, a rare plant collection, family secrets spanning generations, with suitable alterations to protect the innocent, I trust." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Of course, Aunt, though in this case, finding the innocent parties might be the greater challenge." Raymond paused, looking at his aunt with genuine curiosity. "There's one thing I still don't quite understand. How did you know to focus on the missing orchid? Of all the clues present, what made that particular detail stand out to you?" Miss Marple considered the question, her head tilted thoughtfully. "I suppose it was because of something George Lamerton wrote in one of his letters to me, months ago. He described that particular specimen as irreplaceable, the only one of its kind in cultivation outside its native habitat. Such a thing would never simply be misplaced or discarded, not by someone who valued it as he did. Its absence spoke volumes about the priorities of whoever had removed it, and led you straight to Diana," Raymond concluded. "Along with other considerations, yes." Miss Marple rose and began gathering the tea things onto the tray. "Now, dear, if you'll excuse me, I must finish with my roses before the afternoon heat becomes too intense. One must maintain one's routine, even after solving a murder or two." Raymond chuckled, rising to help her. Same old Aunt Jane, dispensing justice and gardening wisdom in equal measure. As they carried the tea tray inside, the telephone rang. Miss Marple answered it, exchanged a few words, then turned to her nephew with a bemused expression. "That was Inspector Craddock again. It seems Diana Westbrook has made a full confession, confirming everything we suspected, and she's revealed one final detail that even I hadn't anticipated." "What's that?" Raymond asked eagerly. "The missing orchid, PT5, wasn't stolen from the greenhouse after George's death, as we assumed. Diana took it 3 days earlier, when she visited Wychford Manor, ostensibly to discuss her company's financial troubles with Victoria. She replaced it with a common look-alike variety, knowing that only George would be likely to notice the substitution. And when he did notice, it confirmed his suspicions about her interest in the toxin, leading to that final journal entry and his intended confrontation." Miss Marple shook her head sadly. "A clever deception, but ultimately a fatal miscalculation for George, for James Carmichael, and for Diana herself. Justice catches up eventually," Raymond observed. "Yes, though sometimes only with considerable assistance," Miss Marple replied, with just a hint of satisfied pride. "Now, those roses won't deadhead themselves, dear, and I believe you mentioned something about starting a new novel." As Raymond took his leave and Miss Marple returned to her beloved garden, the events at Wychford Manor were already settling into the rich soil of village memory. Another chapter in the quiet but remarkable life of St. Mary Mead's most unassuming detective. And in the greenhouse at the edge of the village, Edward Lamerton was carefully tending to his father's orchids, ensuring that from tragedy and deception, something beautiful and healing might yet bloom. 1 week later, Miss Marple sat in her favorite chair by the window of her cottage, working on a delicate piece of knitting while rain pattered softly against the glass. The case of the widow of Wychford had been resolved to the satisfaction of the law, with Diana Westbrook remanded to custody awaiting trial for the murders of George Lamerton and James Carmichael. The village had already begun to move on to other topics of gossip, though Mrs. Blackett at the shop continued to embellish the tale with each retelling, adding increasingly dramatic flourishes that made Miss Marple smile inwardly whenever she overheard them. The gentle knock at her door came as no surprise. She had been expecting this visitor. Setting aside her knitting, she moved to answer it, finding Edward Lamerton on her doorstep, looking more composed than when she had last seen him, though still bearing the shadows of recent trauma in his eyes. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with a small smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, my dear," she replied warmly, ushering him inside. "I was rather hoping you might call before you returned to London. Do come in out of the rain." They settled in her small sitting room, Edward politely declining tea, but accepting a seat by the fire, which crackled cheerfully against the damp autumn chill. "I wanted to thank you personally," he began, "for your kindness throughout this ordeal, and for your discretion regarding certain personal matters. There was no need to expose private family history beyond what was necessary for justice to be served." Miss Marple said simply. "How are you coping, Mr. Lamerton?" Edward sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that reminded Miss Marple poignantly of George Lamerton. "As well as can be expected, I suppose. Mother has been more open about the past, since Diana's arrest, almost as if a weight has been lifted from her. She's told me about Alan, my biological father, and their relationship at university." "And how do you feel about that?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Oddly enough, there's a kind of relief in it," Edward admitted. "I always felt different from the rest of the Lamerton family. Their focus on social position, on appearances, never resonated with me. Now I understand why." "You've been in contact with Professor Harrington?" Edward nodded, a cautious enthusiasm lighting his features. "Yes, we've exchanged several emails. He's currently in Brazil, studying rare orchid species in their native habitat, but he plans to return to England next month. We've arranged to meet." "How wonderful," Miss Marple smiled genuinely. "I'm sure he'll be delighted to discover he has a son who shares his passion for botany." "That's my hope." Edward hesitated, then continued. "What's strange is that all this time, I thought of myself as George Lamerton's son, and in every way that matters, I was. He raised me, taught me, instilled in me his love of plants and scientific inquiry. DNA doesn't change that." "Indeed it doesn't," Miss Marple agreed. "Family is about far more than mere biology." "Which brings me to why I'm here," Edward said, his expression growing more serious. "There's been a development in the case that Inspector Craddock thought you should know about, given your contribution to solving it." Miss Marple's interest was immediately piqued. "Oh? What sort of development?" "It concerns the orchid toxin used to poison my father and James." Edward leaned forward, his scientific training evident in the precise way he organized his explanation. "The forensic laboratory has completed its analysis of samples found in Diana's apartment and cosmetics lab. They've confirmed it's the same compound found in Dr. Carmichael's system, but there's a complication." "What sort of complication?" Miss Marple asked, though a gleam in her eye suggested she might already be anticipating the answer. "The toxin profile doesn't match the samples taken from my father's body during Dr. Haydock's examination," Edward said gravely. "The chemical composition is similar but distinct enough that the forensic scientists are certain they came from different sources." "Different orchids," Miss Marple murmured. "How very interesting." Edward nodded, watching her reaction carefully. "Yes, exactly. Diana extracted the toxin that killed James from the stolen PT5 specimen, the rare Amazon variety. But whatever killed my father came from a different plant altogether, suggesting that Diana might not have been responsible for your father's death after all. Miss Marple concluded, her nimble mind already racing ahead. Or at least, not in the way we assumed. That's what Inspector Craddock believes, Edward confirmed. He's reopened the investigation into father's death, and there's more. When they searched Diana's London apartment more thoroughly, they found letters, dozens of them, exchanged between Diana and James Carmichael over the past year. They were collaborating. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. More than that, they were lovers. Edward's expression reflected his continued disbelief at this revelation. It seems they began an affair shortly after father's death, united initially by their suspicions about the circumstances of his passing. Diana was convinced that mother was responsible, that she had poisoned father to prevent him from changing his will after discovering I wasn't his biological son. And Dr. Carmichael shared these suspicions. Yes, based on trace evidence he'd found during his examination of father's body. He and Diana began investigating together, attempting to prove mother's guilt. Edward shook his head in bewilderment, all while Diana was developing her own extraction methods using the stolen orchid, presumably for her cosmetics business initially. But then something changed. Let me guess, Miss Marple said quietly. Your mother announced her engagement to Robert Havisham. Edward looked at her in surprise. Exactly. According to the letters, Diana was devastated, not just by the engagement itself, but by the betrayal. Apparently she and Robert had been involved for months before he met mother, and she blamed your mother for stealing him away, just as she believed Victoria had stolen everything else that mattered to her throughout their lives. Miss Marple nodded, the pieces falling into place. So Diana and James planned to expose your mother at the engagement party, using the evidence they had gathered about your father's death. That was their original plan, yes. But in the final letter, written the night before the party, Diana wrote something that changes everything. Edward withdrew a folded paper from his pocket. Inspector Craddock gave me a copy. I thought you should see it. He handed the letter to Miss Marple, who adjusted her spectacles to read Diana's elegant, flowing script. Dearest James, everything is prepared for tomorrow. The documents are in order, and I've arranged them as we discussed. Victoria will have nowhere to hide once you present the evidence. It will be painful for Edward, of course, but he deserves to know the truth about his mother. But there's something I haven't told you. Something I've only just discovered myself. The night before George died, I overheard a telephone conversation between him and his solicitor. He wasn't planning to disinherit Edward after all. In fact, he was preparing to update his will to ensure that Edward would inherit everything, regardless of biology. He told the solicitor that blood is less important than the bonds we choose, and that he considered Edward his true son in every way that mattered. This changes everything we believed about Victoria's motive. If she knew George intended to protect Edward's inheritance, why would she poison him? I've been so certain of her guilt for so long that I've never seriously considered any other possibility. But now I wonder, there's something else troubling me. The chemical analysis you performed on the samples from George's body. You said the toxin profile was unusual, different from what you'd expect from the standard orchid specimens. I've compared it with my own extractions from PT5, and there are subtle but significant differences. Could there have been another source? Another poisoner? We need to talk before tomorrow's confrontation. Meet me tonight at the usual place, 9 p.m. There's something I need to tell you about Robert as well. Something I've discovered that casts his relationship with Victoria in an entirely new light. With all my love, Diana. Miss Marple read the letter twice before carefully folding it and returning it to Edward. And did they meet that night? As planned. According to Diana's statement to the police, yes, she claims that she shared her new doubts with James, but he remained convinced of mother's guilt. They argued about it. The next day at the party, James went ahead with the confrontation, despite Diana's reservation. And sometime after that confrontation, Dr. Carmichael was poisoned. Miss Marple said thoughtfully, not by Diana, despite her confession. Edward nodded grimly. That's what she's now claiming. She says she confessed to both murders to protect the real killer, the person she believes poisoned both my father and James. And who might that be? Miss Marple asked, though her expression suggested she had already arrived at the answer. Robert Havisham, Edward replied, his voice hard. Diana claims that during their relationship, Robert showed an unusual interest in father's orchid research, specifically the potential pharmaceutical applications and patent possibilities. He has significant investments in several pharmaceutical companies and was looking for a breakthrough product to rescue one that was failing. So, Mr. Havisham's pursuit of your mother might have been motivated by more than romantic interest, Miss Marple observed. Access to your father's research would be a valuable prize indeed. Exactly. Diana believes that Robert poisoned father to gain control of his research through mother, then killed James when he came too close to discovering the truth. Edward ran a hand through his hair again, a gesture of frustration. But there's no proof. Robert has denied everything, and Diana's credibility is non-existent after her initial confession and the evidence of her own criminal actions. What does Inspector Craddock think? He's investigating Robert thoroughly. Financial records, movements around the times of both deaths, any connections to pharmaceutical companies that might have benefited from father's research. But he's not optimistic. Robert is clever and has powerful connections. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her fingers absently working at an invisible knot in her knitting. Mr. Lamerton, when your father died, what happened to his research notes? His formal documentation, not just the field notebook we found. Edward frowned. Most of it disappeared. Mother assumed Diana had taken it, part of her theft of the rare orchid specimen. That's why James was so frustrated. He couldn't continue the research without father's detailed protocols. And has this missing documentation been found among Diana's possessions? No, that's just it. There's no trace of it anywhere. Diana claims she never took it. How very convenient for Mr. Havisham, Miss Marple murmured. If he did indeed poison your father to obtain valuable research, having the only copy of that research would give him considerable leverage. Edward leaned forward intently. Miss Marple, do you believe Diana's new story, that Robert is the real murderer? Miss Marple considered the question carefully, her clear blue eyes thoughtful. I believe that Diana Westbrook poisoned Dr. Carmichael, either in a panicked response to his public accusations or because he discovered something that threatened her. But as for your father's death, I'm not entirely convinced of her guilt there. So Robert might be responsible after all. It's certainly possible. He had motive, opportunity, and based on your aunt's letter, potentially access to a toxin, similar to but distinct from the one extracted from PT5. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Mr. Lamerton, your father kept duplicate records of his research, didn't he? Any careful scientist would. Edward's eyes widened. Yes, he did. He was almost obsessive about it. He kept backup copies of everything in a fireproof safe in his study. But when Mother checked after his death, the safe was empty. Someone with knowledge of the safe's existence and possibly its combination removed those records, Miss Marple concluded. Someone who understood their value. Robert would have had no way of knowing about the safe, let alone accessing it, Edward mused. But Diana might have. She visited often enough. Or perhaps someone else altogether, Miss Marple suggested gently. Someone who had regular access to your father's study and intimate knowledge of his habits. Edward stared at her, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. You can't mean Mother, but why would she take his research if she wasn't responsible for his death? To protect it, perhaps, to ensure it didn't fall into the wrong hands? Miss Marple raised a delicate eyebrow, or to use as leverage in negotiations with someone who very much wanted it. Someone like Robert Havisham. Edward sat back in his chair, momentarily stunned by the implications. You're suggesting that Mother knew or suspected Robert's true motives in pursuing her? That she was using father's research as, what, a bargaining chip? It would explain several curious aspects of her behavior, Miss Marple said carefully. Her insistence on proceeding with the engagement party, even after discovering Robert's relationship with Diana. Her apparently genuine shock at Dr. Carmichael's death. Her failure to drink the poisoned tea Diana had prepared for her. You think she suspected someone might try to poison her? Edward asked incredulously. I think your mother is a more astute woman than either her sister or Mr. Havisham gave her credit for, Miss Marple replied. And I think there may be one final chapter to this story that has yet to be revealed. Edward stood abruptly, pacing the small room in agitation. I need to speak with Mother. If she has Father's research, if she knows something about Robert's involvement. Before you do, Miss Marple interrupted gently. Consider the possibility that your mother has been playing a dangerous game to protect both you and your father's legacy. If Robert Havisham is indeed the calculating killer Diana now claims him to be, confronting him without adequate proof could be exceedingly dangerous. Edward paused, conflict evident in his expression. What would you advise? Speak with Inspector Craddock first. Share your suspicions about the missing research documentation. A careful search of Wychford Manor, with your mother's cooperation, might yield interesting results. Miss Marple smiled reassuringly. The truth has a way of emerging, Miss Lamerton, even from the most tangled of circumstances. As Edward prepared to leave, thanking Miss Marple once more for her insights, she added one final thought. And perhaps when you meet with Professor Harrington next month, you might ask him about his own relationship with Robert Havisham. The botanical research community is rather small after all. Their paths may have crossed in ways that could prove illuminating. After Edward had gone, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, but her mind remained engaged with the puzzle of Wychford Manor and its inhabitants. Like the most complex of garden designs, this case had revealed itself in layers, each new growth of understanding exposing deeper roots and more intricate patterns than initially apparent. The widow of Wychford, it seemed, might yet have secrets of her own to reveal, and Miss Jane Marple, patient observer of human nature in all its flawed complexity, would be ready when those final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The autumn rain had given way to a rare spell of late October sunshine when Miss Marple received the invitation to tea at Wychford Manor. The elegant cream card, embossed with the Lamerton family crest, requested the pleasure of her company that Saturday afternoon for the resolution of certain matters in which your assistance has been invaluable. Raymond, who happened to be visiting his aunt that weekend to gather material for his new novel, raised his eyebrows when she showed him the invitation. Intriguing, he commented. The plot thickens, it seems. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, her eyes bright with interest. I had a feeling we hadn't heard the last of this affair. When Saturday arrived, Raymond insisted on accompanying his aunt to Wychford Manor, ostensibly out of concern for her comfort, but in reality, Miss Marple suspected, out of writerly curiosity. The manor looked different in the golden autumn light, more welcoming somehow, as if the shadows that had hung over it during the engagement party had finally lifted. They were greeted at the door not by a servant, but by Edward Lamerton himself, who welcomed them with genuine warmth. Miss Marple, Mr. West, thank you for coming, he said, ushering them into the grand entrance hall. Mother is waiting for us in the library, and we have another guest I think you'll find most interesting. He led them through the house to the library, a handsome room lined with leather-bound volumes and featuring tall windows overlooking the gardens. Victoria Lamerton rose from her seat by the fireplace as they entered, elegant as ever in a simple but beautifully cut dress of deep burgundy. Miss Marple, how kind of you to come, she said, extending her hand. And Mr. West too. I'm delighted you both could join us. But it was the third person in the room who immediately captured Miss Marple's attention. A tall, distinguished-looking man in his late 60s, with silver-streaked dark hair and the kind of deeply tanned complexion that spoke of years spent in tropical climes. His eyes, a striking shade of blue that Miss Marple immediately recognized from Edward's face, crinkled with intelligence and humor as he was introduced. Professor Alan Harrington, Edward said, a new note of pride in his voice. My father. Your biological father, Victoria corrected gently. George will always be your father too, Edward. Of course, he agreed with a slight smile. I'm fortunate enough to have had two remarkable fathers, it seems. Professor Harrington shook hands with both Miss Marple and Raymond, his grip firm despite his age. I've heard a great deal about you, Miss Marple, he said in a deep, pleasant voice. Edward tells me you were instrumental in unraveling the tragic events surrounding George's death. I merely observed what was there to be seen, Miss Marple replied modestly. Though I confess, I believe there may still be aspects of this case that remain unclear. Victoria exchanged a meaningful glance with Edward. That's precisely why we've invited you here today, Miss Marple. There are revelations that should be shared, now that certain matters have been resolved. They settled into comfortable chairs around the fireplace, where a small but cheerful blaze took the edge off the autumn chill. Tea was served by the housekeeper, Mrs. Wilson, who gave Miss Marple a respectful nod of recognition before withdrawing discreetly. "I should begin by saying that Diana has withdrawn her accusation against Robert Havisham," Victoria said once they were alone. "She now maintains that she alone was responsible for both George's and James Carmichael's deaths." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a significant reversal of her position." "We believe she was threatened," Edward said bluntly. "Robert visited her in prison last week, supposedly to clear the air about their relationship. Since that visit, she's refused to speak with the police about him at all. That's most concerning," Miss Marple frowned, "though not entirely surprising. Mr. Havisham struck me as a man accustomed to getting his way by whatever means necessary." "You're more perceptive than I was," Victoria said with a touch of bitterness. "I allowed myself to be thoroughly deceived by him." "Perhaps not as thoroughly as he believed," Miss Marple suggested gently. Victoria's green eyes met Miss Marple's with a flash of acknowledgement. "No, not entirely. I had begun to harbour suspicions about Robert's true interest in me, and in George's research, even before Diana's dramatic accusations at the party. Which is why," Edward added, "Mother took certain precautions that have proven most fortunate." Professor Harrington leaned forward, his expression serious. "Miss Marple, what I'm about to tell you must remain confidential for the time being. At Inspector Craddock's request, the investigation has taken a significant turn in the past week, and premature disclosure could jeopardize the case being built." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed, setting down her teacup with careful precision. "I am the soul of discretion, I assure you." 2 days after our conversation, Edward explained, "I spoke with Inspector Craddock about the missing research documentation. He arranged for a thorough search of the house, with Mother's full cooperation." "And did this search yield results?" Raymond asked, unable to contain his curiosity. Victoria smiled faintly. "Not initially, because what they were looking for wasn't here at all. It was in a safety deposit box at my bank in London, where I placed it the day after George's funeral." "You had secured your husband's research notes?" Miss Marple nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. "Very prudent of you, Mrs. Lammerton. I may not have understood the scientific details of George's work," Victoria admitted, "but I knew it was important, potentially valuable. After his death, I found James Carmichael going through George's study late one night, supposedly looking for notes he needed to continue their joint research. Something about his manner struck me as not quite right. Too furtive. So you removed the documentation to protect it," Miss Marple concluded. "Yes. I told no one, not even Edward. I wasn't sure who I could trust." Victoria's hands twisted slightly in her lap. George had mentioned concerns about his research being targeted by pharmaceutical interests. He was particularly wary of a company called Meridian Pharmaceuticals, which, as it turns out, Edward interjected, is majority owned by a holding company controlled by Robert Havisham. "A connection that would not have been immediately apparent," Professor Harrington added. "Havisham has been careful to keep his ownership of Meridian obscured behind layers of corporate entities. But why would Mr. Havisham be so interested in George's orchid research?" Raymond asked, thoroughly engaged in the unfolding story. "Because," Professor Harrington explained, "George and James had discovered that compounds from the Phalaenopsis toxica could be modified to create an effective treatment for a particular tropical parasite that affects millions of people worldwide. Current treatments are expensive and have severe side effects. Their formulation promised to be both more effective and dramatically cheaper to produce." "A humanitarian breakthrough," Miss Marple observed. "Exactly," Edward nodded. "Father and James intended to patent the process, but license it at minimal cost to ensure widespread access, particularly in developing countries, which would have been disastrous for Meridian Pharmaceuticals." Victoria continued, "As they had just invested millions in developing a competing treatment, one that was less effective, but promised to be extremely profitable under traditional patent protections. So Robert Havisham had a powerful financial motive to suppress George's research," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "But that doesn't necessarily make him a murderer." "No," Professor Harrington agreed, "but this might." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a sealed envelope, which he handed to Victoria with a grave nod. Victoria opened it carefully and extracted several sheets of paper, laboratory reports, from the look of them. These are the final toxicology results on the samples taken from George's body, she explained. Professor Harrington, with his extensive knowledge of tropical plant toxins, was able to identify something the initial tests missed. The poison that killed George wasn't from Phalaenopsis toxica at all, Edward said, his voice tight with controlled anger. It was from another plant entirely, a rare species of strychnos found only in certain regions of Malaysia. A plant that shares some chemical markers with the orchid toxin, but is actually quite distinct, Professor Harrington elaborated. And one that I happen to know Robert Havisham encountered during his time as a botanical investor in Southeast Asia. He funded several expeditions there in the early 2000s, specifically looking for plants with pharmaceutical potential. The same toxin, Victoria said quietly, has now been found in trace amounts in a pen that Robert gave James Carmichael as a gift the day before the engagement party. A pen with a small reservoir in the cap that could deliver a lethal dose through minimal skin contact. My word, Raymond murmured, looking both horrified and fascinated. That's diabolically clever, and nearly impossible to detect unless one knows exactly what to look for. Professor Harrington nodded. Which, fortunately, I did. Miss Marple had been listening with careful attention, her expression thoughtful. And Inspector Craddock now has this evidence. Yes, Edward confirmed. Along with financial records showing substantial short-selling of Meridian pharmaceutical stock by one of Havisham's shell companies the day before Father's death. A move that yielded millions when news of his passing caused a brief spike in Meridian's share price. Robert has been taken in for questioning, Victoria added. The inspector believes an arrest is imminent once they've fully traced the origin of the Malaysian toxin to Havisham's possession. And Diana? Miss Marple inquired gently. What of her involvement? A shadow crossed Victoria's face. Diana did poison James Carmichael. That much she's admitted and the evidence confirms. But I now believe she was telling the truth when she claimed she didn't kill George. She took the orchid specimen and attempted to develop her own extraction process for her cosmetics line. Certainly. But George's murder was Robert's doing alone. Though Diana may not be entirely innocent regarding Dr. Carmichael's death either, Edward said gravely. We've discovered that James had learned about Robert's connection to Meridian Pharmaceuticals. He was planning to expose him at the engagement party, not just for his relationship with Diana, but for his suspected role in Father's death. So Diana may have killed Dr. Carmichael, not just out of jealousy over your mother, but to protect Robert as well, Miss Marple suggested. It's possible, Victoria admitted. Their relationship was complex. Diana felt that Robert truly loved her, that his pursuit of Mead was merely a business strategy to gain access to George's research. She may have believed she was protecting their future together by silencing James. A tragic miscalculation, Miss Marple murmured. For I suspect Mr. Havisham was using her just as thoroughly as he attempted to use you, Mrs. Lammerton. Victoria nodded, a mixture of sadness and anger in her expression. Robert has no loyalty to anyone but himself. Once he realized I had secured George's research beyond his reach, he was already planning to discard me. The only reason he proceeded with the engagement was to maintain his access to Wychford Manor and the greenhouse. He needed specimens of Phalaenopsis toxica to analyze, Professor Harrington explained, to determine if he could reverse engineer George's process without the research notes. That's why several plants showed signs of tampering, which everyone assumed was Diana's work. Miss Marple nodded in understanding. A convenient misdirection. Robert played us all masterfully, Edward said bitterly. Father, mother, Aunt Diana, James, even me. I never once suspected him. Few would have, Miss Marple assured him gently. Mr. Havisham presented a most convincing facade of respectability and charm, and he exploited the existing tensions within your family with remarkable precision. But he didn't count on Mother's foresight in securing Father's research, Edward said, with a proud glance at Victoria. Or on your observations, Miss Marple. Victoria smiled wanly. I may have been foolish enough to be briefly taken in by Robert's charade, but I've never been quite as naive as people tend to assume. Growing up with a sister like Diana taught me to be cautious with my trust. And yet, Miss Marple observed, despite everything, you still visited her in prison. after her confession. That speaks to a certain capacity for forgiveness, Mrs. Lammerton. Not forgiveness exactly, Victoria sighed. Understanding, perhaps. Diana and I have always had a complicated relationship. She resented me. I pitied her. Neither position was particularly conducive to genuine sisterhood. She paused, her expression softening slightly. But she is still my sister, and I believe she genuinely regrets her actions now, especially as she's realized how thoroughly Robert manipulated her. Professor Harrington, who had been listening quietly, now leaned forward. There is one more piece to this puzzle that I think you'll find interesting. Miss Marple, something that connects all these tragic events to their beginning, decades ago. I'm all attention, Professor, Miss Marple assured him, setting aside her empty teacup. When Victoria and I were students, he began, his voice tinged with reminiscence. I was researching tropical orchids even then, particularly their medicinal properties. Diana, who was studying pharmacy, often assisted me in the laboratory. She was brilliant, methodical, with a natural gift for chemical analysis. She admired you greatly, Victoria added, with a hint of old pain in her voice. Yes, too greatly, as it turned out, Harrington nodded. I was oblivious, focused entirely on my research, but Diana developed feelings for me that I couldn't return, particularly after Victoria and I became involved. Another triangle, Miss Marple murmured. History does have a way of repeating itself. Indeed, Harrington agreed grimly. When Victoria and I parted ways for reasons that seemed insurmountable at the time, Diana saw her opportunity, but by then my heart was elsewhere. I left for Brazil soon after, unaware that Victoria was carrying my child. He glanced at Edward with unmistakable paternal pride. Diana never forgave either of us. I think her relationship with Victoria became one of competitive resentment, while she channeled her scientific interests into cosmetics rather than pure research. A choice I believe she came to regret deeply. And then, decades later, George Lammerton began corresponding with you about his orchid research. Miss Marple surmised, the pieces clicking into place. Unaware of your connection to his wife's past. Exactly, Harrington confirmed. George and I became professional colleagues through correspondence, sharing findings about tropical species. When he acquired specimens of Phalaenopsis toxica, he naturally consulted me, as I'd published several papers on related orchids. It was through this correspondence that he began to notice similarities between Edward and descriptions of me, both physical traits and intellectual interests. Harrington continued. He became suspicious, conducted DNA tests, and confirmed his concerns, but rather than reacting with anger, as Victoria feared he might, George reached out to me directly. He wrote to you about Edward? Victoria asked, clearly hearing this for the first time. Yes, about a month before his death, Harrington nodded. A remarkably generous letter, explaining that he had discovered I was Edward's biological father, and that he planned to tell both of you the truth. He believed Edward deserved to know his heritage, and he felt secure enough in the family he had built to face that reality. So father wasn't planning to disinherit me after all, Edward said softly. Diana was right about that part. No, quite the opposite, Harrington assured him. George wrote that he considered you his son in every way that mattered, and intended to ensure your inheritance remained secure. He even suggested that you and I might collaborate on future research, combining your botanical knowledge with my expertise in tropical species. Which means, Miss Marple interjected gently, that Victoria had no motive whatsoever to poison her husband. In fact, George's plan would have resolved the situation in the most amenable way possible for all concerned. Exactly, Harrington agreed. But by then, Robert Havisham had already identified George's research as a threat to his pharmaceutical interests. The pending revelation of Edward's parentage merely provided convenient cover for his true motive. He expected suspicion to fall on Mother. Edward realized, a wife with an apparent motive to silence her husband before he could disinherit her son, a scenario Diana believed all too readily, Victoria added sadly. She always thought the worst of me, even before Robert began poisoning her mind further, and when James Carmichael started investigating George's death. Miss Marple continued, thinking aloud. He became a threat to Havisham's carefully constructed plan, particularly once he connected Havisham to Meridian Pharmaceuticals. Yes, Edward nodded. James discovered the connection just days before the engagement party. He confided in Diana, not realizing that by then she was already emotionally entangled with Robert, who promptly used that knowledge to manipulate her further, Miss Marple concluded, suggesting that James's accusations threatened not only Robert, but Diana herself. Given her theft of the rare orchid specimen, Robert convinced Diana that James had become unstable, dangerous to both of them, Victoria said. She poisoned him, believing she was protecting their future together, only to discover later that Robert had been using her all along, Miss Marple said softly. How very sad. A gentle silence fell over the library as they all contemplated the tangled web of deception, jealousy and tragedy that had ensnared the Lamerton family. Raymond, who had been taking mental notes throughout, looked slightly overwhelmed by the complexity of it all. Inspector Craddock believes the case against Robert is solid, Edward said finally, breaking the silence. The financial evidence alone is damning, and with Professor Harrington's identification of the Malaysian toxin, conviction seems likely. And Diana? Miss Marple inquired. She'll still face charges for James's murder, Victoria replied, her expression troubled. But her cooperation regarding Robert's involvement may mitigate her sentence somewhat. Her mental state will certainly be taken into consideration. And what of George's research? Raymond asked. His breakthrough treatment for tropical parasites. Edward and Professor Harrington exchanged a significant look. We're continuing his work, Edward said with quiet determination. Together, the patents will be filed under the Lamerton Harrington Foundation, a non-profit organization we're establishing to ensure the treatment reaches those who need it most. George would have approved. Victoria said softly, it's what he always wanted, for his work to make a real difference in the world. Miss Marple nodded, approvingly. From tragedy, sometimes the most beneficial growth can emerge, like certain plants that flower most prolifically after being pruned back severely. Another garden metaphor, Aunt Jane, Raymond teased gently. When one has spent as many years tending roses as I have, dear, Miss Marple replied with a twinkle in her eye, one tends to see the parallels between horticulture and human nature. Both require patience, careful observation, and an acceptance that beauty and danger often coexist in the same species. After tea, Edward insisted on showing Miss Marple the greenhouse, which had been transformed in the weeks since the engagement party. Gone was the air of neglect that had begun to creep in. Instead, the space hummed with purposeful activity. New equipment had been installed, and several assistants were carefully tending to experiments under Edward's and Professor Harrington's supervision. We've relocated the Phalaenopsis toxica specimens to a secure laboratory at Cambridge, Edward explained, as they walked through the warm, fragrant space. But Father's other orchids remain here, continuing to thrive. In the center of the greenhouse stood a newly installed plaque, bearing an inscription that made Miss Marple smile with approval. In memory of George Lamerton, whose passion for knowledge was exceeded only by his compassion for humanity. May the fruits of his research bring healing to those in need. As they prepared to leave, Victoria drew Miss Marple aside for a moment of private conversation. I wanted to thank you properly, she said, her voice low and sincere. Without your observations and insight, Robert might well have succeeded in his scheme. Edward and I would have remained estranged by suspicion and doubt, and George's work might never have been completed. You give me too much credit, my dear, Miss Marple demurred. I merely noticed what was already there to be seen, and you played your own part admirably. Securing George's research was a most prudent decision. Victoria smiled faintly. Perhaps I'm not quite the decorative, empty-headed widow that people assumed me to be. I never thought you were, Miss Marple assured her. The most effective gardens often conceal their structure beneath an appearance of natural simplicity, just as the most capable women sometimes find it advantageous to be underestimated. As Raymond drove Miss Marple back to St. Mary Mead in the gathering dusk, he shook his head in wonderment. What an extraordinary case, Aunt Jane. Multiple killers, scientific intrigue, family secrets spanning decades. I couldn't have invented a more complex plot if I'd tried. And yet, Miss Marple observed, at its heart, it was driven by the most common of human emotions. Greed, jealousy, resentment, love. The setting may have been more elaborate than usual, but the motivations were entirely familiar. Will you miss it? Raymond asked curiously. The investigation, I mean. The mental challenge of unraveling it all. Miss Marple considered this as they passed through the quiet village streets. Perhaps a little, she admitted. But there are always new puzzles to solve, dear. Human nature being what it is, one needn't look far to find mystery and intrigue. Even in a place as seemingly tranquil as St. Mary Mead. And indeed, as they approached her cottage, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Blackett from the village shop in animated conversation with the vicar's wife at the garden gate, both women glancing repeatedly toward the home of Colonel Bantry, with expressions of barely suppressed excitement. "You see?" Miss Marple said, with a small smile of anticipation. "The next mystery may be waiting just around the corner." For like the most persistent of gardeners, Miss Jane Marple knew that the cultivation of truth required constant vigilance, unfailing patience, and the wisdom to recognize that beneath the most carefully tended surface, secrets inevitably took root, waiting for the right observer to bring them, at last, into the clarifying light of day.